meeting of the Economy Committee. Some members will be perhaps attending this morning's meeting via Starleaf, and our witnesses will be briefing via Starleaf. The meeting will be broadcast live when open to the public, and a recording will be made available on the committee's web pages on the Assembly website. Any bill briefings will be hand-sorted as per protocol, and just to remind members to mute their tablet devices. So moving on then to item number 1, which is apologies, and we have received apologies from Claire, and we know Matthew and Stuart are going to be a little bit late. So moving on then to item number 2, which is draft minutes. There is a copy of the draft minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of February at page 5. Are members content that those are an accurate reflection of the meeting?
Content. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there is a copy of the a draft record of decisions from the meeting held on the 9th of February at page 9. Are members content with those?
Thank you.
So item number 3 then is Chair's business. 3.1 on page 3 of table papers is the oral statement from the Finance Minister from yesterday with an update on budgetary matters. Just to refer members to point 7.1 and 7.6 in matters arising, which are the letters from both the Economy and Finance Ministers respectively regarding ESF match funding. The Finance Minister indicated that he has written to the Economy Minister on the issue of community groups needing match funding for the ESF programmes, and states that the Economy Minister could prioritise this within his own budget. The Economy Minister suggests that unallocated funding from this financial year cannot be rolled into the 2022-23 financial year. However, the Finance Minister's statement yesterday indicates that it will, and he has indicated that the Economy Minister can seek to prioritise this spending. So he suggested also that he had written to the Economy Minister with a proposal that would provide a solution in relation to the match funding. So perhaps we could write and seek some clarity around what that proposal is, and if the Economy Minister is going to take him up on that. Obviously, we're well aware of the pressure that those groups are under, and the jobs obviously that are on the line and people being put on protective notice, but also all of the people that they support, and some of the most vulnerable in our community. So it would be important that that's got over the line.
Check up on that, Chair.
3.2 then is the briefing slides from the informal meeting that we did with Hydrogen NI last Thursday. That's at page 13 of our table papers. Peter, do you want to give a wee quick update on that?
The slides are pretty comprehensive. I suppose if I boil it down, Hydrogen NI recently set up, Firmus and Phoenix are part of that. A lot of the discussion was around blending hydrogen into the gas supply. So 20% hydrogen into your gas supply gives you 6% of your energy. Don't ask me about the science. So it means that pretty much 6% of your billable energy would be hydrogen, and that mix can be increased over time, but the impact on appliances would also become greater. That first 20% blend can still be done with appliances and boilers the way they are. Beyond that, you're looking at replacement. The key issue for them was being able to scale up production of hydrogen to a level that meant you could bring the price down and also export it. That would need to be done over time, but they also need challenge funding for that. So again, that's where the energy strategy is going to come into play, and whether or not there's going to be funding around that. I won't go into science because I didn't totally get it. But the slides cover pretty much everything else. But that was the issue that they were basically bringing forward, was there needs to be funding and planning so that hydrogen can be scaled up to make it usable and user-friendly. They mentioned the issue around wanting to use the salt caves. I think there's still a lot more work to be done around that, and the environmental impact issue as well of the super saline outflow that creates, I'm not entirely sure, makes the sea incredibly salty and creates a dead zone or whatever. So I think there's a lot more thinking around that needing to be done, and they talked a bit about that as well. But yeah, that was by and large, Chair, you have more idea of the science.
I know just there obviously is the challenge around the Island McGee issue, and huge community concern and opposition to that. So that's obviously something that is ongoing. It was a very interesting briefing. Obviously, you know, there was there's significant interest in hydrogen at the minute. The emphasis of their briefing was very much on green hydrogen and on using the spare wind energy capacity to provide or to generate hydrogen that could be used then in a variety of
There's a nice
different.
graphic of that in their slides.
So no, Peter.
It was very useful.
You had mentioned the Hydrogen Academy previously.
Yes, so there's a Hydrogen Academy set up in, I think it's near Ballymena, and they said they were looking at kind of widening that out so that there would be a supply, but they also were very focused on the idea of being able to reskill and upskill people who are in existing sectors. You know, they were very clear there's a lot of people with a very transferable skill set that can be skilled up or skilled over, if you like, to provide the workforce for this. They seem to think there was quite a significant number of jobs, ultimately, if you scaled it up, so that you're supplying everywhere, you're having hydrogen vehicles, you're using the wind energy issue as well. Didn't fully understand how that worked, but it seemed to be a way of creating hydrogen much more cleanly and helping to offset the issue of high energy requirement to create the hydrogen, because it's electrolysis, so you'd be using a lot of electricity with it. So they did seem to have thought of those sorts of angles, and it would also mean, I suppose, solving some of the issues around storing energy from wind turbines that can't be fed into the grid at that time, or those sorts of issues around renewable being less predictable.
Just ask a question. In terms of them reaching 20% mix, what timescale is that? And I'm just thinking of the cost on consumers.
I think initially they were suggesting it would be more expensive because of the small scale of production, but once they could ramp up production and once hydrogen was much more widely used, and if they could get to the point where they can export it, that cost will come down. I don't think we got real figures.
No, we didn't get figures, and they were kind of talking about pilot projects, and I guess that's where it would fit with the Energy Strategies Action Plan as well, because they talked about doing some pilot studies.
And the challenge funding, that would be really key for that too. So it would have to be, the pilot would be subsidised so that you roll it out but people won't have a cost impact. But it's getting the challenge fund money, because at the minute, while those sorts of pilots are outlined in the action plan for the energy strategy, there isn't budget with it. And there isn't a legislative programme in place yet, and obviously you've got the issue then of the utility regulator having an ability to regulate all this as well. And will there need to be changes there? Like we've talked before, the committee's talked before about modifications to the role of the regulator and how that needs to be done and what it needs to look like. So there's a lot of side issues to work out in conjunction with the energy strategy, the action plan, and whatever funding's likely then to be available. And it's cross-cutting also with DAERA and the climate change bills and money that DAERA has around renewables and other energy sources. And they talked a little bit about biomethane, and it didn't fully that fitted in, but they did talk about that. And again, that's a cross-cutting issue with DAERA. There was a lot to think about, but a lot of coordination required. So it's definitely one to prioritise for the new committee and the new mandate.
There's no particular actions for us coming out of it?
No, not coming out of that. I think they just wanted to introduce themselves and indicate what their particular issues were, their focus and so on. But it's really kind of getting all those ducks in a row to really facilitate that. They did express concern that if it wasn't scaled up quickly enough and we weren't making use of what we could do here and seeking to export, that we would become an importer and indigenous production would never really take off. So it was kind of one of those the time is now briefings.
Or a bid for funding?
Or a bid for funding as well. I think that was implicit, that they would need that challenge fund money. I don't think there was any kind of shyness about that. Obviously with Firmus and Phoenix being involved, they're commercial and they're not afraid to talk money. But again, that all needs to be settled. and we're not.
Who is Firmus and the other companies, parent companies?
Now you're asking. I can check back on that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's been a lot of movement in the sector and a lot of takeover and consolidation. But I'll check up on that and come back.
It's Firmus. Sorry, who's the other company?
Do you know who will know our next witnesses? I guarantee some of them will know exactly who owns what.
They're owned by
ask them,
Equitix
John.
Investment
Sure, questions,
Management.
So it's like
Who?
Equitix Investment
Like-
Management. Does that advance our knowledge?
so it's more like venture capital type money than large sectoral company. Okay, we'll try and work that one out.
Okay, so then there's a final item under Chair's business to just remind members that the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit that I had agreed to attend in December, but that was postponed because restrictions were reimposed, has now been rescheduled for next Friday. Myself and Sinead McLaughlin, who's chair of the Executive Office Committee, will attend as the, obviously, Executive Office Committee has the other kind of remit in respect of Brexit. The items on the agenda are quite a high-level agenda, introductions
high-level,
and
Chair.
updates from each of the legislators, and a discussion on potential for further work for the Interparliamentary Brexit Forum. So that's just for members to note, and obviously we will feed back to committee after that
Yes, Chair.
meeting. Okay, so moving on then to item number 4. It's the departmental and Fibrus broadband briefing. There's for an update on Project Stratum. There's a clerk's memo at page 15 of our packs, and DFE's briefing on the Project Stratum update at page 17. There are slides from Fibrus at page 23. There is a record of the 2nd of November meeting, which was the Project Stratum briefing for the committee, page 27. And then DFE's response to the committee regarding Project Stratum from the 12th of December at page 33. So if I could welcome to the meeting this morning Jeremy Gardner, who's Director of Telecoms and Tourism in DFE, Nigel Robbins, who is the Project Director for Project Stratum in DFE, Trevor Forsyth, who's the Project Manager in DFE, Conal Henry, who is the Chairperson of Fibrus, Dominic Kearns, who's the Chief Executive of Fibrus, and Shane Haslam, who is Programme Director of Project Stratum for Fibrus. So I'm going to hand over to yourselves to make an opening statement, and then we will bring members in for questions. So over to yourselves.
Thank you, Chair. Nigel Robbins here. I'd just like to introduce Director of Tourism Telecoms, Jeremy Gardner, who has joined us recently for an introduction. Jeremy, over to you, and then we'll go through the other introductions.
Yes, thank you, Nigel. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I have recently replaced Geraldine Fee as the Director of Tourism and Telecoms in DFE. Geraldine has recently taken up a post in TO. So I would just basically like to thank the community for the chance to provide an update this morning on some of the important developments with the project since you were last briefed on Stratum. I'll pass you over to Nigel Robbins, our Project Director, who will provide a short update, and then on to the Fibrus team, who will take you through a short presentation.
Thank you.
Nigel.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Good morning, Chair and Committee. Nice to be here to update you on Stratum. Just some quick introductions before a brief summary, and then Fibrus will take you through their mini deck, just 3 slides, but packed with useful information. I'm Nigel Robbins, the Project Director, working with DFE colleagues via the Strategic Investment Board on the development and implementation of Project Stratum, and we're a year on from contract award, of course. You would be familiar with Trevor Forsyth. Over to you. I think you're on the mute there, Trevor, but Trevor will just sort his microphone out. Trevor's the project manager working on Stratum within DFE Telecoms. And Trevor, you're there.
Sorry about that. Too many things to press. I'm the project manager looking at the day-to-day management of the contract, liaising with Fibrus as they roll out the project across Northern Ireland.
Thanks, Trevor. And quick introductions from our Fibrus friends. Connell, over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the time to lay out our stall. I'm Connell Henry. I'm founder and co-founder and chair of Fibrus, and with me is Dominic Cairns, the chief executive, and Shane Haslam, our project director. So I'll hand back to you, Nigel.
Thank you. So we're all here, present and correct, and a very brief summary from the department's perspective for the committee on where Stratum is before Fibrus talk you through the good progress they've made this past year. So as the committee will be aware, the contract was awarded in November 2020, utilising £165 million of public funding to get to 76,000 premises in the target intervention area. The target intervention area at that time, just shy of 79,000 premises. So we knew we needed to secure additional funding to bring into the contract 2,500 harder to reach premises that were out of scope. But the deployment that got underway immediately after contract award has resulted in over 22,000 premises being passed in the first year of deployment, and as Fibrus will tell you, they're slightly ahead of schedule. So despite the pandemic and Brexit and other challenges, that's good progress. But we always identified the need to secure that additional funding, and we also recognise a need to interrogate further the data set that helped form the intervention area. And so that was a process that commenced after contract award through engagement with colleagues at LPS and others. And we've, as a result of that, identified additional eligible premises to bring into scope, all of which are in what are called white postcode areas, where there are no commercial providers providing qualifying broadband services. So the result of that was 8,500 premises were eligible to be brought into scope, and we secured £32 million of additional funding. So DCMS contributed 70% of that, that's 22 million, and DFE and DERA splits the remaining 30%. So that 32 million also includes an additional contribution from Fibrus. So the entire network build cost is 247, almost 248 million, of which more than 48 million is Fibrus's own contribution to network build. So that means 85,000 homes and businesses across Northern Ireland are going to benefit from Project Stratum. As we've said before, the characteristics of the intervention area unique in many ways for Northern Ireland because, as you'll know, the longest telegraph pole line lengths here, more telegraph poles per capita in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in the UK, 4 times more. And so it's a deeply rural intervention area. So 97% of those homes and businesses are Band H, NISRA Band H, so in clusters of 1,000 or less, or sparsely populated countryside. So a gargantuan infrastructure project. So 85,000 premises will be benefiting. And Fibrus wrote to all of the 8,500 premises that are now in scope of the contracts. They've all received letters informing them that they're now in scope, and those citizens can go onto the Hyperfast website and continue to monitor deployment plans. So before I hand over to Fibrus, in the department, we continue to interrogate data. We continue to recognize challenges that are characteristic of telecommunications implementation across the UK, and we'll continue to do that across the 3 years remaining of the project so that premises can be brought into scope where possible, and that no premises are left behind where they are eligible and where the commercial market is not going to them. So questions later, but first over to Fibrus, and if the clerk is content just to free up the shared screen for Trevor Forsyth, who's going to bring up the Fibrus deck. And there are 3 slides that Shane and colleagues will talk you through. So if Trevor, you can bring up the Fibrus deck, we'll hand over to Connell, Dominic and Shane.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you to the chair and the members for providing us with the opportunity to present a progress update in relation to Project Stratum. So Trevor, if you could go to the second slide, please. So this slide provides us with a high level view of the key highlights, the key deliverables effectively during the course of late 2020 through 21, and then as we outlook into 2022. I suppose before I go through the slide, it's important to provide some context. So just to follow on from Nigel's point in terms of the amount of infrastructure that's required, we expect to deliver something in the region of 16,000 kilometres of fibre with this project, and utilise up to 250,000 poles effectively during the course of the build. So it's no mean feat in terms of the project scale and key deliverables. If we look at the progress that's been made during the course of the last year, starting with contract signature in November 17th, we pretty much started on that day to build a network, what we would refer to as a vertical takeoff. The reason why that's so important, folks, is because typically in projects of these types of projects, the scale of these projects, typically other providers and services would be designed and surveyed for 6 to 9 months before the network effectively begins to be built. So the fact that, as I run through the progress during the course of the year, it's important to keep that in mind. As we started in November, we had our first build of premises in Coal Island, just over 1,000 premises in February, and we released those premises during March to meet our contractual commitment, our first key milestone. And as well as that, we had our first customer connected to the network itself. And as we look through the other 3 quarters, so we have exceeded our contractual target for premises passed during June in through September. And as we finished out the year, we had a target of delivering just over 19,000 premises to be delivered and released to sales. And we exceeded that at just over 22,000 premises passed. So an excellent result as we go into year end, considering that 6 to 9 month period that typically needs to exist in order to mobilise. As well as that, one of the key features of Project Stratum that we adhere to is delivery from our social responsibilities, our social contract responsibilities. And in this year, we've delivered 1,431 new entrant trainee hours effectively, which equates to 44 new entrant trainees. As well as that, we've delivered 100 hours digital inclusion services and liaise with various parties to deliver that. As we look now into 2022, as Nigel had referenced, we have now rolled in those 8,500 premises into the Stratum rollout, and they are now effectively baked into the plan and will be delivered. The first of those premises we expect to be delivered during the next quarter, and those will roll out during the course of the Stratum rollout into March 2025. In terms of February, we have effectively now designed all of our what we would refer to as our geographies that we're building network in, and those are ready now for build, and we're on track to exceed our quarterly contractual targets as we look into March, now currently targeting 29,000 versus 27,000. And as we run through to December of this year, you'll see that we are planning and forecasting to exceed each of those key targets from a milestone perspective into December of this year, where we'll exceed our contractual target of 52,000 premises passed, just over 53,000. That effectively equates to just over 60% of the overall phase deployment to be completed in Project Stratum. So, that in the context of mobilising and building during the course of a global pandemic, as well as dealing with all sorts of issues in relation to material availability and so on and so forth, we believe that this is an excellent result so far. So if you just move on, Trevor, to... Okay, so the second slide, folks, provides us with a pictorial view of the scale of the build and where the build effectively is happening across NI. So the green bars on the left-hand side show the geographies effectively that we're building network in, not those particular towns or locations. It's effectively the wider hinterlands that we're building network to. And then as we look out into June of this year, you can see that we're building network pretty much across all areas of Northern Ireland at this stage. And as I say, the fact that we beat our target of 19.6 in 2021 and we're on track to deliver the target into December 22 is something that we're extremely proud of. So we just move on, Trevor. So just finally, this final slide, folks, is it brings together, those first two slides talked about the build and the progress in relation to the build and meeting our contractual milestones, but we're acutely aware of how important, key stakeholder engagement and marketing is. First of all, to create awareness and to ensure that we're engaging with community organisations whenever we're building in the areas to create awareness and demand stimulation, and as a result, we built a robust stakeholder management function. We've received just over 4,000 general political and public queries to date. We've held a number of community events, what we would refer to. We obviously, because of the pandemic, we would have liked to do a lot more of those events in face to face, but just to the nature of the pandemic, we had to deliver a lot of those virtually, and we're still a very much a success. We have, as Nigel said, sent out 8,500 letters to advise people that they're now included within Project Stratum. And one of the key things that I would say would be to utilise Hyperfast NI. It continues to be our first point of contact for inquiries, for verifying if the premise is in scope for to be delivered and when that premise from a seasonal perspective is due to be delivered. We continue to utilise our social media, our omni-channels and social media and so on and so forth to ensure that we keep the public informed. And a key thing that I would say is that registration of interest via Hyperfast NI is a key way for constituents to register their interest and ensure that we get back to them whenever we're building in the area to get them connected as quickly as possible. In terms of now that hopefully we've an opportunity to get back out into the public, we've invested in a showcase vehicle effectively, and that vehicle you'll see in the slide there will be utilised for events and for education purposes to create awareness within communities, potentially within schools as well, to show what Project Stratum is all about, for to allow the communities to engage with us and effectively be on the ground a lot more now. In terms of our volunteering hours, we've talked about the fact that we've delivered 100 volunteer hours this year, and we've a further 100 planned, potentially over 100 actually in 2022. And then finally, on AONB, we have obviously a 28-day notice period that we provide obviously to councils. We follow the permitted development order of 2020 as a utility provider, effectively building infrastructure within NI, and we liaise very closely with rural community networks, the likes of National Trust, Ulster Wildlife, and so on and so forth as part of that process, and that's a key part of the stakeholder engagement. One other point that I just want to raise is that we're currently working through a self-build, self-fund launch for Q2 of this year. And what that effectively will deliver is a means whereby constituents that aren't included within Project Stratum, either the initial core of 76,000 or the 8,500 that have been rolled in, can engage effectively with us, and our team will work with them to provide the best means possible to connect them to our network. In other words, explore the opportunities and provide the customer with a solution in that. And then we're at the stage now from an additional RSP's perspective that we've just in the process of creating final signature for our second RSP effectively to come onto the network, and we expect that to complete in the next 3 to 4 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. And happy to take questions from the committee chair.
Okay, thank you for that, for both the department update and for Fibrus's update. Obviously, I think that it is very good news that those additional 8,500 premises are included now in the scope, and that additional funding has been secured. And I think obviously good progress being made in terms of the rollout. And I think every MLA sitting here and every MLA and every elected representative across the north will know how big an issue that access to decent broadband actually is for the people that we represent, and it's a vital utility. It's no longer a luxury. Everybody requires broadband for access to whether it be school or work or whatever it is, and that has been so much more apparent over the last couple of years where people were working and studying from home. So we still continue to be contacted by people who fall short of the scope of Project Stratum for various reasons. I had a really useful response from yourself, Nigel, in relation to some constituents that I had been in touch with you about in relation to, in this particular instance, where premises were built after the contract area was agreed, and that where they will not be able to come into the scope. So I guess it's a question in relation to that point that you made yourself, Nigel, about where possible bringing premises into scope where they are eligible, and a particular emphasis on what eligible means, and then how that links to the self-bill, self-fund point that we just finished on there in relation to how we can support constituents to engage with Fibrus around potentially being able to access broadband via, if not Project Stratum itself, but via Fibrus's rollout, and what is the potential additional cost. And I think the point that was made in your response to me, Nigel, was that there shouldn't really be leftover fibre from Project Stratum, because they should be utilising it as much as possible. But if, given the significant levels of public funding that have been put into Project Stratum, is there an onus on Fibrus to ensure that as many people who might just be outside the scope of the intervention area are brought into it? And is there pressure, for want of a better word, from the department to ensure that that happens?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So very good points there, and I'll ask Fibrus to expand on this, particularly on the new build, existing new builds, the self-dig option. There are a couple of interesting things happening with new builds. The UK government's Minister for Digital Data and Digital Infrastructure, Julia Lopez, recently wrote to the Economy Minister because DCMS published last month consultation seeking views on plans to introduce mandatory gigabit capable infrastructure in new build premises across the UK. And because new builds are a devolved matter, they are encouraging the DAs to support that, and there's been engagement from the Economy Minister and the Finance Minister on that. Also, the Economy Minister will be meeting with Julia Lopez on the 8th of March, and they'll touch on that, but also Project Gigabit, which we'll come to later. Just before I ask Fibrus to talk a little bit about their aspiration to bring into scope as many premises as possible, and that includes those new builds that are out of scope because the cutoff point for the state aid intervention area, which had to be captured at a point in time, was January 2019. But there are other premises that we're working through that are part of a process, and there are essentially 4 reasons that a premises might be out of scope. One would be if it's a new build and it was past the cutoff point. Another would be if it's under review, and that's a state aid process where wireless internet service providers have indicated they can provide qualifying next generation access broadband services to these premises. So there are 7,500 premises that are under review, and we will be drawing our conclusions at the end of this quarter to determine whether or not the wireless internet service providers can back up their coverage claims or not, and then we have the opportunity to recategorize premises if that's not the case. Premises that have received vouchers, broadband vouchers, UK government scheme vouchers previously would not be eligible. And there could be some premises that have dropped out of commercial infrastructure providers' plans, Openreach, for example, and we continue to engage with Openreach on this matter. And plans do change. We recognise that commercial operators' plans change, but it is a source of frustration when you need to find a solution for premises, and if a supplier is not going to them. Our aspiration is to ensure that no premises are left behind. So those are some of the issues we're working through. The new builds, Fibrus, perhaps Shane, you could just expand a little bit on the capacity issue, how you can create capacity to potentially consider additional premises.
Yes, thanks, Nigel. So first and foremost, thanks for the question, Chair. In relation to connecting premises to the network, it's our ambition to connect as many customers as possible to the network as effectively as we possibly can. And in a situation where that is feasible, then we will connect the customer pretty much immediately once we receive the order. In a situation whereby the customer is not on scope for Project Stratum, or if we take a new build as an example, it's a pretty good example to use. The self-bill, self-fund option provides us with a mechanism whereby we can then liaise with that customer. We can go out, we can complete a survey, we can verify what infrastructure is required in order to connect the customer to a network. And when I say what infrastructure is required, I'm talking about incremental infrastructure effectively over and above what we already have in place. And each customer will have nuanced special circumstances effectively that need to be considered as part of that survey. And then at that stage, we'll liaise with the customer and to find the best solution to connect them to the network as cost effectively as we possibly can. So that's where we've noticed that there's been a lot more inquiries now from customers, obviously, that aren't included within Project Stratum or currently in plan for Project Stratum. And we hope that this self-bill, self-fund solution will provide a means and a mechanism to capture as many of those as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. And are the vouchers able to be used for that process? The broadband vouchers? The USO?
Trevor, I'll just ask Trevor to describe the voucher process. Yeah.
There are a couple of voucher schemes operating in broadband. There's ones that are managed by DCMS, have a voucher scheme in place. The USO is a different scheme that's handled by BT. BT have been designated as the organisation in Northern Ireland who handles USO inquiries. So that's a different way of consumers acquiring a usable broadband connection. But that service can only, I think, comes in at a minimum of 10 meg, and they make an application to BT for that. The vouchers are administered by DCMS. I believe I probably Fibrus might be in a better position just to check whether they are on that scheme, as it's managed by DCMS, and whether they avail of vouchers where it can be used.
So Trevor, yes, we are on that scheme. I suppose there's a slight complexity in how those vouchers are issued, that they have to be part of an overall programme, but if there's enough properties that could come together to get a package approved, yes, vouchers could be used for those self-dig, self-fund customers.
So would that be the community fibre partnership ones that you would be talking about there, or are individuals able to?
I think the community fibreship partnership is a name BT/OpenReach use for their implementation of the voucher scheme.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And Nigel, you mentioned the recategorisation of some premises, and that work is going to be completed by the end of this quarter. Would any additional funding be required for premises that would be recategorised, or would they be able to be included in the rollout that's already planned?
Yes, it may be the case that additional funding will be required. We've utilised the headroom funding provision of the contract to bring in the additional 32 million, and there is still scope to utilise an additional 3 million before the 200 million pound cap is reached. I should also say there are 37 premises that are currently on our radar that are outside of scope, and that Fibrus are conducting site surveys to determine the most cost-effective or viable solution for. They're all surrounded by bodies of water, so 28 are on Rathlin Island, for example, and so we do intend to bring solutions to those premises if possible. But for those premises that may be recategorized because a wireless internet service provider has been unable to provide qualifying information to support their coverage claims, then we would look at potentially creating capacity under Stratum There are two ways that they may be addressed, either through Stratum or future intervention. But there is an issue we're working through with Fibrus, and we're engaging with LPS and local councils on this. And it's to do with data, and that is derelict premises. So Fibrus, as they deploy, have identified a number of derelict premises that are categorized as built and approved on the pointed data set and have not been categorized yet as derelict. And that may be because the information through the councils hasn't flowed through over the years, but we want to work with all key stakeholders to improve that quality of the data, so that although Pointer wasn't designed to support telecommunications interventions, we think it would benefit from this process, because we recently scoped about 200 premises that are derelict, but we'd rather do it all at once rather than on an ad hoc basis. And that may free up important capacity to bring premises into scope, because there is a mechanism in the contract to do that. So for example, those under review premises. So those are some of the things we're working through. In addition to that, Project Gigabit is an important next step potentially for the department. It's part of the UK government's aspiration to ensure that every home and business across the UK, regardless of location, has access to gigabit-capable broadband. And Northern Ireland is probably uniquely placed and is in a better position than the rest of the UK, in that, based on the good commercial investment, mainly in urban areas, there's 78% of premises that currently have access to gigabit-capable broadband in Northern Ireland, higher than anywhere else in the UK. After Stratum, that'll be 88%. And Project Gigabit seeks to close the gap where, and this will be predominantly rural premises, the commercial operators will not provide gigabit-capable infrastructure to premises. So you could have premises that have a super fast speed of 30 or 40, but can never go any higher because they're reliant on potential copper line services. So that's what Gigabit is there for, but it could also bring into scope any premises that Project Stratum wouldn't have the capacity to bring into scope. And that's why we're continuing to engage with DCMS to make sure that these two projects can complement each other. But getting back to Stratum, we're very much focused on maximising coverage under Stratum any way we can, so that premises benefit from this intervention.
No, that's very useful, Nigel, so thanks for that. And I guess it's something that we can be kept updated on over the next wee while as well. Just a final question from me, and it's for Fibrus, and it's just around the pricing structure. So we've had some contact from constituents that has indicated that the pricing structure in towns is different from in rural areas. And just wanted to get an understanding of why that would be the case.
Yes, I'll hand over to Fibrus. We've also engaged with citizens and MLAs on this issue. To summarise it, there is no pricing disparity across the Fibrus network based on whether or not you're living in an urban or a rural area when you look at the entry-level pricing. For example, 150 meg service through the commercial arm of Fibrus ISP would be $39.99, and so that's on par, comparable with the likes of BT, Virgin, and other services. It is the case, though, that sometimes discounts are offered, and there's sometimes geographical-based discounting, and you're more likely to have discounting where there is more competition. It's a commercial reality. On the wholesale level, the prices are benchmarked and tested and monitored, and that's where we work with Fibrus networks. But I'll ask Fibrus just to explain the difference between the Fibrus networks hyperfast entity and Fibrus ISP, and that pricing issue, and a perception that there is a disparity when perhaps it's more based on whether or not an introductory discount has been offered to a citizen. Shane, would you like to expand on that one?
So, Dominic, do you want to take that one?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so Sorry, I missed a question there.
Dominic, the question's about pricing. Is there a disparity based on whether or not you're living in an urban area or a rural area? And I was just asking if you could describe the difference between Fibrus networks and hyperfast and the Fibrus commercial arm.
Yeah, okay. So, look, we we have a standard price, and I'm talking from a Fibrus ISP point of view. We have a standard price for our packages, but what you'll find is in areas, as you've explained, Nigel, there is where there's competition, we would generally offer discount to acquire customers. How that works in practice is at Fibrus Networks level, we sell the services to Fibrus ISP, and as you will know, there's the option for many other ISPs to join that network and purchase the same services that Fibrus ISP offer in the Stratum areas.
Okay.
Thanks, Dominic.
So essentially, it's a case of in some areas there is other providers that can offer packages to customers because they can access the fibre network, and in those instances, discounts are offered essentially to gain the customers. Is my understanding correct?
So, Conal here. I think it's not quite as simple as that. There are discounts offered in certain areas to stimulate demand, but in the Stratum area, it's within any operator is free to take a wholesale service off of Hyperfast NA off of our network, and to provide retail services and discount them at whatever level they feel is appropriate. It's telecoms, so it's a little bit complicated. But the Stratum network is a wholesale network, and Fibrus as a retail service provider is only one retail service provider on that network. Other network service providers can come on that network and offer discounts as they see fit. So there is competition on the Stratum network.
But it would be for additional providers to seek to access the network in certain areas, and they may not wish to do that, and therefore there would be no competition in some areas. And I guess you can understand why people who would live, and it seems to be in rural areas, would feel hard done by if they're not being offered the same level of discounted packages as people elsewhere because there are other providers.
Yeah, I mean, as Nigel said, our wholesale pricing on Stratum has been benchmarked, so I don't think there's any great disincentive for retail service providers to come and offer services on the Fibrus network, and those benchmarks are in line with national benchmarks and not rural. So that, you know, in the long run, and I think it's the issue is one of the newness of the network and the fact that retail service providers are still getting used to what the Stratum network can do and how it is they will operate it. I think in the long run there'll be a fairly flourishing competition for retail service providers on that network, but at the moment it just takes a little while for that to bed in. I mean, this network's a 50-year asset minimum, so it's important that we get the network build right, and then that competition is allowed to flourish in that network for the life of the network.
And just to be clear, the network will be an open access network, as Connor described. So Fibrus ISP won't have a monopoly. There will be healthy competition, and we think the first one or two RSPs are about to sign up shortly. But as the network matures, it would be like any other network where consumers would have choice, multiple choice, and therefore be able to avail of discounts and challenge their provider to offer them the most attractive service. So that will be the case as the network matures.
I would make one final point as well on this, and it is around the reality of the investor proposition in Stratum. I mean, Stratum is a gap-funded model, and the wider the gap between economic payback and the cost to build a network, the larger the subsidy or the fewer the homes that can be afforded with the subsidy in hand. So if money is invested in discounts that then undermines or reduces the commercial return to an operator, that will actually increase that operator's requirement for subsidy or reduce that operator's ability to generate coverage, which again would go against policy.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to bring in other members. Mike, you're first up.
Chair, thank you, and gentlemen, thank you for your engagement. As the Chair says, this was always an essential project, but even more so post-COVID. I've been contacted by 2 people this week who knew this session was coming, so I'll ask questions effectively on their behalf. The first area is Telegraph Pools. You have permitted development rights, including conservation areas, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and areas of special scientific interest. So the question is this: how do you address the concerns of citizens and residents who take a negative view of these poles being erected?
Okay, and that's one we'll ask Fibrus to expand on, as we've been dealing with some correspondence recently on this issue, and there is a high level of consultation prior to deployment that Fibrus will address. Also, during the evaluation process, there was detailed criteria against the environmental impact component that was assessed, and Fibrus scored highly in this area. It's obviously an area that the department takes very seriously. But Fibrus, I'll just ask you, please, to describe the process you go through, that consultative process, before you put a pole in the ground or not, as the case may be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thanks, Nigel. So, look, as a utilities provider, Fibrus has electronic code powers and adheres to the Planning General Permitted Development Order of 2020. Planning permission is applied for positioning of the poles and network infrastructure, including ducting to local councils within that notice period that I've referred to earlier. In terms of the design of our network, we consider carefully the positioning of these poles. We're always keen through this consultation that I've referred to at rural community network level, through Wildlife Trust, National Trust, and so on and so forth, to ensure that we don't include any unnecessary duplication or impact effectively of those poles as they're rolled out. We're also mindful to ensure that the poles are not sited in obviously prominent positions like bends and roads and so on and so forth. Where residents have concerns on the positioning of poles, our build team have done and will work closely with the residents to see how possible we might be able to reposition those poles.
So do you write to residents? Do you knock doors? Who gets consulted? So
as part of the process, we would engage obviously with where there's a rural community network, we would engage with those. Where we need to plant poles effectively on public ground, we would consult obviously with the local councils. If it's obviously a pole that's required on private ground, someone's house potentially or close to someone's house, then we would obviously have to go through that WILI process and consult with the resident as part of that process. But what I would say is that during the course of the build this year, there have been many occasions that we have liaised directly with residents to look at options available, whether it meant moving poles or siting poles in a different location to remove any visual impact, or in certain cases to remove potentially issues where the furniture, as we refer to it as the polling infrastructure, would not be sited at prominent road locations.
Thank you. The other area, which is one that I think I raised with the committee previously, was customer satisfaction. And in our packs, you refer to pilot surveys conducted between March and July of last year. But you don't give us any raw data, but simply you say the contractor indicates that overall survey results are positive. Now, I have to say, as the statutory scrutiny body, looking at a project involving well over £150 million of public money, I don't think that's satisfactory under any circumstances, but particularly in a post-RHI environment.
Yeah, so...
Okay, go ahead, sorry, Dominic.
Yeah, so I suppose, as you might expect, given the nature of the technology, the new nature of technology and the services, there has been huge demand, and we're seeking to continually improve that service provision that we provide for our customers. And when we were awarded the contract, service delivery as a function customer experience as well, sat across a number of areas in the business. So what we done was we brought those functions into one service-focused department, and that's now been headed up by the delivery director. But I think the biggest frustration our customers may be experiencing is around the less than straightforward nature of the installations that we have to perform in Stratum. And as you'll appreciate, there's a lot more complexity in those installations in rural areas, given we need to receive the likes of way leave and permissions, and have to put in substantially more infrastructure to get the customer connected. And generally this will take more time than our standard 7 days. But so that we understand those frustrations. We're continually evolving and are focused on putting the customer front and centre of the business. On the specifics around measuring that, Shane, do you want to give some more specifics on what we're intending to do around measuring customer satisfaction?
Yes. So thanks, Dominic. So in terms of the measurement of customer satisfaction, we're implementing customer satisfaction surveys that are due for to be delivered in the next quarter. We are also implementing NPS scores effectively as well, in terms of how the service is being delivered and how we're rolling that service out to our customers as well. We're also embarking on liaising with our customers through multiple different channels, through social media, through omni-channel as well, to ensure that, you know, as issues arise, we can deal with those issues in a timely manner and resolve them as quickly as possible. If I could just follow on from Dominic's point in some of the nuances that we see in Project Stratum, obviously just with the geology, with the locations that you're looking to connect, you're going to have some additional complexities, and this is where sort of self-build, self-fund comes in, folks, whereby, you know, you may have a solution to connect that customer as cost effectively as you can with poles, for argument's sake, but the customer doesn't want that. The customer wants it delivered a different way or a different means effectively. So we believe that, you know, through this consultation, through NPS, through customer satisfaction scores, and as well as omni-channel contact with that customer base, we can deal with these issues as they arise in a much more timely manner. And the fact that we've now got a complete dedicated service delivery function effectively in place for this very purpose, we believe that will improve significantly.
I think what we can say, Shane, is that we will provide the department with more detail on the results of those surveys as our surveying activity, our customer satisfaction activity progresses. I mean, I would take the point on board around the need for public accountability of how well the investment in this infrastructure is going. So we're fully cognizant of that, and we work with the department to make sure that as much information as we can is made available on customer satisfaction.
Okay, thank you.
There's also on that, our weekly meetings with Fibrus, we do invariably spend a lot of time talking about single customer issues. There may be one or two a week, but they are discussed, and quite often they're related to Fibrus ISP or RSP, and so Fibrus networks follow up on our behalf and keep the department informed. And so far, we're satisfied with the follow-up, but we are, I think, due to have a workshop with the Fibrus ISP team in the next 2 weeks, in which we'll be learning a little bit more about on the commercial side, the customer satisfaction initiatives. But we engage too, of course, regularly with Fibrus Networks on the measures that Connell and Dominic have described.
And we would encourage members of the committee and other elected representatives to engage directly with Fibrus around individual constituency issues, and we're happy to deal with that. And I think my personal view is that's probably the best way to deal with individual specifics is to talk directly to us.
Okay. Well, I said two people had contacted me. One I didn't know, one I do know and trust. And what they said was that they emailed Fibrus in August with a problem, and the response came in October. And they also pointed me to a website called Trustpilot, which you'll be aware of, where 31% of reviews say you're excellent, but 56% say you're bad. And I'm not going to quote some of the particular comments underneath it, because they're pretty devastating.
We're well aware of that. The first thing to say about that, Mike, is that a lot of that feedback relates to areas. Fibrus, you may well be aware, as well as in 77,000 or the homes in the Stratum area, is investing its own shareholder funds in over 100 towns around the north. And most of our customers, the vast majority of our customers at the moment, are not actually using the Stratum network. They're using the network that we've built ourselves. And it is fair to say, particularly in parts of South Down, that we had network performance issues that we have now addressed, but that those network performance issues created significant levels of customer dissatisfaction. But I would stress that those network performance issues were not in the subsidised network. They were in networks that we built with our shareholder funds.
Okay, I think just in conclusion, I think customer satisfaction is an area that the committee or the next committee may wish to revisit. Chair, thank you.
I think, as Dominic said, it's an area that we're focused on. It's not, for the avoidance of any doubt, if you think that Fibrus is here saying that we've got it completely right all the time, we're not. We're focused on it ourselves, and we would expect that our customer satisfaction performance would be, it already is improving and will continue to improve as the project becomes more mature.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Keith?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate the information so far. I have a few questions here. First one's regarding the 8,500 additional premises. What method did you use to basically put them across each area? You know, what way did you divvy that 8,500 out? What method did you use?
Okay, Keith, thanks for the question. My screen was frozen, but it seems to be okay now. I'm, by the way, one of the premises that was out of scope, the harder to reach. That's why my broadband is poor. When we looked at the 8,500 premises, that comprised 2,500 premises that were harder to reach and required more infrastructure, and then the 6,000 that were associated with the data anomalies on pointer. So grouped together as 8,500, it was more cost effective to get to all 8,500 than it would have been 2,500 in isolation. But Fibrus conducted the network design based on the most efficient way to deploy across the network. It's important to say that the 76,000 premises that are part of that awarded contract are in no danger of being delayed by this process. So the contractual obligations that Fibrus are aware of, they are standing over and are slightly ahead of schedule. But I must commend Fibrus on their solutions-focused mindset. When we presented them with this challenge, they quickly adapted the network design to take into account those additional premises and design the network as efficiently and as quickly as possible. There are 3 categories of premises, which I'll ask Fibrus to explain in terms of how they've determined the placement and the deployment timeline of those 8,500 premises. And invariably, it's based on ease of infrastructure or very difficult, longer to get to, more infrastructure required. But Shane and colleagues, could you perhaps describe that for Keith, how you've amalgamated the 8,500 across the network? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nigel. Thanks, Keith. So in terms of the 8,500 premises, the approach that we used was 3 different approaches that we utilised. Obviously, we had the 76,000 premises that we needed to build as part of Project Stratum. So what we would refer to as the premises that required very little infrastructure in order to connect them. So in other words, they were directly beside a premise, so to speak, that was already being delivered on Stratum. We would pick those up as part of the build. So in other words, if we're building within South Down, and there's a number of those premises at the moment, we would build those effectively as part of this build at the moment. Then there was another bunch of premises that would have required some additional infrastructure, so would have required additional build. We also would have built some of those into our existing build, so as we roll out the network itself. But those premises that have been completed, as in the areas, the geographies that have been completed thus far, we'll have to go back at the end and retrofit those. The reason being for that is because it's absolutely critical that we remain on track for the core Stratum rollout itself, as Nigel has referred to. And then the final group of premises Nigel referred to were what we would refer to as the hard to reach premises. So those are premises that require significant amounts of infrastructure, additional infrastructure, even off the sort of open reach path, so to speak. These would have been probably the most remote premises that we would have seen across NI, and the plan is that we will build those effectively in the final year, effectively, of the contract to allow us additional time to get those complete. So the good news on the 8,500 is those premises that we can fold in and we can build now effectively, we already have done so, and we've folded them and baked them into our plan. And those premises that are much more difficult to reach, we will capture those obviously as we complete the build, or we retrospectively go back and complete those in the final year of the contract.
Okay, so I just want to follow on, if I may, Chair. I'm looking at a map here from Ulster, Sheehan, and there's an original plan of 8758. Future funding, which I presume is part of the 8,500, is 183. And then you have another little pink box here, data anomaly of 727. Is that data anomaly referenced in the pointer system? Because obviously at the very start of this process, we talked about the white list, and the white list was taken from LPS. But the LPS system wasn't right, so therefore those houses that was there but weren't there. Is that what data anomaly means?
I'll be happy to take that. And Trevor, do you want to, you start and I'll fill in if required.
Yeah, data anomalies are records that we have looked at, and there is some uncertainty about what the record is being shown in pointer. We have used secondary records to cross-reference against pointer, and those are the data anomalies that have popped up. Those are, when we were looking at pointer, we were looking at premises that were recorded as being built and approved. And then the secondary information we started to look at was cross-referencing that with valuations data that was provided to us by LPS. And that is one of the cases where anomalies start to arise.
So what happens?
So Keith,
sorry, go ahead.
So sorry, Keith, the 727 premises, therefore, would be in white areas, and you'd be aware some of them would have neighbours that were in plan, and so they were perplexed as to why they were not in plan. And that's because the categorisation of built and approved was not there on pointer at the time of the open market review exercise. And so the process, working with LPS colleagues and others in LPS, was to look at the valuations list to determine if those premises should have been categorised, or it would have been appropriate for them to be categorised as built and approved because they were occupied by rate-paying citizens in January 2019. And in LPS's defence, the data set, of course, wasn't created for this, but it is the most credible data set that there is, used by other government departments and the emergency services, but it's reliant on what's fed into it by local councils and Royal Mail. And so, perhaps that process will improve, and so that the categorisation is more timely. But that process therefore captured those premises, so all of those that were incorrectly excluded and that were built and approved are now in scope.
So how do we change then the data anomaly figure of 727, and I'm picking at Ulster for obvious reasons. How does that figure reduce? So how do we get that data anomaly 727 down to theoretically zero?
Well, the 727 are now in scope, if I understand your question correctly. So those were the premises that we identified as being incorrectly excluded. So now they're part of the 8,500 premises that have been brought into scope. So all of any premises that is referenced as a data anomaly would be what we call category C, would be those that were not categorized as built and approved where they should be. They wouldn't include the under review or premises that have dropped out of commercial plans. But so all those 727 will now be in scope of the contract as part of the 8,500 that have been rolled in.
Okay, and just two quick questions if I may, Chair. I don't know, it's probably a Fibrus question. How much capacity do you leave on your network? For example, if you're going down a country road or laneway and there's 10 houses down it, how much, and you're obviously going to the 10 houses, how much capacity do you leave in your network for future, future houses in there? Or do you just build it for the 10? How tight is that?
So I'll take that question, Dominic. So in terms of the network sizing, obviously it's a public subsidy contract, Keith. So from a build perspective, it's not designed in such a way that we're leaving ourselves multiple ports on every single road that we leave that we can use for a future expansion. So it's sized in a way that provides the most cost effective and best value for money, if you like, for the public purse. But it doesn't mean that there's no ports available to serve any other customers on that road. So it's effectively been designed in such a way where you maximise the rollout reach effectively and connect as many customers as possible. So if I take that example that recently we worked on, Keith, together, whereby if we had designated a port for a particular premise that maybe wasn't there anymore, we can reutilise that port for to serve, in that case, that particular customer that you were looking after.
Okay, and last, Nigel, at the start you ran through those figures very quick and you failed to mention confidence and supply. I know that wasn't obviously intentional, but I'll have to mention it.
Forgive me.
There was 150 of that, and then 15 of DERA, which was your first 165 million. If you go over you don't mind the 8,500 additional premises, I think it was a 32 million figure. What was the breakdown of that 32 million?
Yes, thanks, Keith. So the breakdown is 70% contribution from DCMS. You may recall it was last summer that the DCMS's minister announced up to 25 million was being allocated to Project Stratum to address 8,500 premises. We were still working through the governance and approvals processes regarding those premises, and it took some time to go through the many levels appropriately of governance and state aid assurance. And final approval came just before Christmas in December with DOF approval. So 22 million is the final figure that DCMS are contributing, and it's 4.85 million that DFE and DERA are contributing each. So that's the makeup of the close to that 32 million, and then Fibrus are increasing their contribution by 2 million. So we have 197 million contract value for Stratum and a 247 million network build cost, of which north of 48 million is Fibrus's investment.
Okay, I'll just finish with this. So obviously there can be some issues, and we all have a few constituents coming on from time to time, but we've got to, I suppose, appreciate the build and the massive task this was and what it's doing to real people. Give you an example. I've been speaking to Julian, which I must pass on to Fibrus, doing a very good job communicating with ourselves. One lady just outside New Mills was receiving 2 megabytes in the morning, and at the night, whenever Fibrus connects, was receiving 98. So that's real life change, and I appreciate not everybody's going to get that, but there's more than that, and there is a negative. So I'm obviously, my glass is half full today, not half empty, and I appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And on that point, I very good points that Mike Nesbitt raises. We take them very seriously, but it is important to look at the positive aspects of this too. More than 22,000 homes and business have access to transformational broadband, and the example you give is a very good one. There are a lot of happy customers, but we spend a lot of time focusing on those that either there are challenging circumstances, which means it's taking longer to provide a service to them, or where there are complaints. We will take them seriously. And in Julian Simpson, whose name you mentioned, Keith, the head of stakeholder engagement at Fibrus. So Julian and the team every Thursday in our meetings will take us through their stakeholder engagement, including how many customer inquiries they've had, how many they've dealt with, what the lag is. And we might give an example of a couple of months, and unfortunately, nobody wants to tout those figures. In most cases, it's a matter of days before people receive a response. The department is in a similar position, but when you have peaks of correspondence, of course, it takes longer to provide a detailed response. But I do commend Fibrus on the way they're handling this. But we do take very seriously those customers that are aggrieved, and but we recognise there are more positive customers or content customers at the moment, but it's the aggrieved ones that we will spend more time dealing with appropriately.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Keith. John.
Thank you everyone for your presentation thus far. I'm not convinced public money was needed to be invested in this sector, but I am convinced that the outworkings for the public and those houses and business who have got it has been life-changing in many circumstances and has proven very valuable. But given that it's such a hugely profitable sector, I do think that the private sector, if they're taking it on, could have taken on these investments much sooner. But that's a debate for another day. I want to return to the issue of accountability. As Mike has said, this committee's task is to scrutinise the work of the Department of the Economy and also support, where we can, the work of the Department of the Economy. But listening to the briefing over this last hour or so, I'm not sure where the Department of the Economy ends and Fibrus starts. And I'm not sure the relationship here is what it should be. And in my opinion, the relationship should be that the Department of the Economy is the management and Fibrus is the service provider. And it's the role of the Department of the Economy to hold Fibrus to account, not to explain what Fibrus is or isn't doing. So can you outline to me exactly how the Department of the Economy is holding Fibrus to account and ensuring that the public are getting value for money here?
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for the question. I know you've raised the issue of whether or not subsidy is needed in the past, so I won't spend too much time on that, but we do respectfully disagree that without this gap funding model, these homes and businesses in predominantly rural Northern Ireland would have had to wait for a very long time or would have never had access to gigabit capable broadband. But we have seen commercial investment in the urban centres, and that's for perhaps another day. We absolutely do hold Fibrus to account, and I'll ask Trevor to expand on this in terms of the contract management obligations. We're the contracting authority. We're on good terms, but we hold Fibrus to account. There's a live example that Trevor and I have been discussing this morning where we're withholding payment until we're satisfied with further explanations regarding a milestone claim. We have a cordial relationship because of the positive solutions-focused mindset that Fibrus have adopted, but absolutely there is no doubt that there is a line between us when it comes to who is the contracting authority and who's the contractor, and a very rigorous process to test the claims before any payments are made against deployment, but also other issues that we've touched on today related to customer service or indeed the installation of poles. But Trevor, perhaps you can expand on that point to reassure John.
The project is managed according to the Prince 2 methodology commonly used across the civil service for managing large projects. There's a senior responsible officer designated in the department, Paul Grocott. His deputy is Jeremy Gardner, who's with us today, and then that's overseen by a project board. There are representatives there that represent the supplier's interests, which is Fibrus, the customer's interests, which is represented by a senior official. It's Nigel represents the customer's interests for the board, and I provide the various project management and reporting mechanisms. There are formal reports that Fibrus have to submit to us through the contract, looking at things such as their rollout plans, marketing plans, benefits to SMEs, and those are scrutinised by ourselves to ensure they are adhering to the terms of the overall contract. On top of that, we have appointed independent experts and advisors to give us the necessary technical and financial advice to look at areas relating to the contract, including the open book accounting, the accounting mechanisms, to also review things like the costs of deployment as well. So we have quite a large, and then on top of that, I oversee a team of 5 staff who are tasked with actually doing vouching and verification of the contract. And Fibrus provide us with details as to the premises they are providing services to, the costs of providing services in an overall area that have been incurred, and those then are scrutinised to ensure that Fibrus have properly incurred that expenditure. In addition to that, Fibrus themselves also report to BD UK with figures and information about the project, so that at a UK level, there's oversight of overseeing what the costs of deployment are to make sure that they're not being seen as excessive or at odds with other similar deployments in the UK as well. So we have, at this stage, a set of accounts has been presented to us for scrutiny, and we're now just working through the process of checking those off. Internally, then, we also have internal audit within the department, who are currently also undertaking an exercise with us to look at the mechanisms we have to oversee Stratum. And you'll also be aware that recently the audit office looked at the procurement of Stratum as well. So it's also been subject to that sort of scrutiny. So there's been quite a bit of oversight and scrutiny given to the project so far, and we continue to welcome that and use it as learning as to how we can improve the overall management of this contract so far. As mentioned so far, Fibrus have been performing really well in relation to the conditions of the contract, and we've had very few areas where we've had to discuss them with them but at this stage we're satisfied Fibrus are delivering to the contract as we would hope at this point.
Has there been any gateway reviews carried out of the project in this last 6 months to a year?
No, the last gateway review was the investment decision, Gate 3. The next gateway is Gate 4, which is readiness for service. So we're not, at the moment, we don't have a plan to undertake that because the infrastructure deployment hasn't been completed by Fibrus. Our intention was that would be the opportunity.
It might be too late also. As a former chair of the Public Accounts Committee, one of the lessons I learned from it was that you can have all the accountability mechanisms, policies in place, governance in place, but unless they are being properly utilised, then they're meaningless. And one of the best ways, or one of the ways, of checking those is through a gateway review. Now, I'm not a fan of doing too many gateway reviews because you can spend a lot of time navel-gazing and not delivering, but you certainly do need, particularly on a project of this scale, to reassure yourselves on a regular basis that the policies and accountability mechanisms you have in place are working, and the best way to check that is an outside observer.
I'd welcome another gateway review. John, the first two came in challenging circumstances when there was a danger of the confidence and supply funding falling away, but we would certainly welcome further scrutiny. We did have a casework committee review of an addendum to the OBC, which was part of the approvals process for securing the funding for the 8,500 premises in advance of state aid assurance. So we would certainly welcome further scrutiny, and I believe we can stand over the robust governance process. I take your point. There's no point in having these processes unless they are challenged. We've had an NIAO audit, 2 internal audits, 3 casework committee reviews, and 2 gateway reviews. I would certainly welcome another gateway review at the opportune moment.
Okay, just one more question, Chair.
Just on behalf of Fibrus, I'd endorse that. We would be very happy for that to take place also.
Conal, just when you're in the eye line, a question for you too. You ended your previous answer to the Chair in relation to the cost differential between towns and rural dwellers. I can't exactly remember the exact term you used, but you did say at the end of it that it would be against policy. I don't know if you recall. Which policy or whose policy were you referring to?
So what I mean by that is if we use, if we reduce the revenue available on the network, you increase the amount of subsidy that needs to be that is required to build that network. If you and either the result of that is against policy, because either you need more subsidy to deliver the same number of houses, or the same subsidy delivers a reduced number of houses, and either of those outcomes I would have thought is against policy.
But whose policy?
Your programme for government to deliver full fibre broadband coverage across Northern Ireland.
Well, I think that might be a liberal interpretation of it. It depends on what your view is of how much subsidy is required and who's making what where. So that's an interpretation.
Of course it does. Yes, absolutely, John. But I, that's, I'm just sort of saying what the spreadsheet says.
But exactly what the spreadsheet. It depends who's looking at the spreadsheet as well. Whose interest is looking at the spreadsheet. But in terms of, I got the impression, rightly or wrongly, that Fibrus is going to make as much money out of the system, which is in one way fair enough, and maybe another way not. As much money out of this rural connection as long as you're the monopoly provider as possible. That's what I was left with the impression at the end of your answer. So
we are investing our shareholders' funds for return. Though our shareholder is pension funds, it's your pension, my pension. It's the public sector and private sector pension investment. That's where that money comes from. It's there. Broadband infrastructure for a pension fund is a long-term return. Those returns are freely available, and the oversight can see the returns that we will make on the Stratum network and can review them over the long run. They're not supernormal. And I think a lot of the problems in broadband is that the old phone companies have been making supernormal profits and are looking to retain those supernormal profits and refusing to invest the supernormal profits they're making out of the profits they used to make from phones, basically in the past, that they're now not making in from broadband. We're very comfortable for whatever level of scrutiny to see on the returns that we make in this network, and it is worth bearing in mind that our investors are pensioners.
Yes, but and the taxpayer who put £165 million into the project, many of them will be pensioners too. So have you taken into consideration your rural broadband pricing under Project Stratum, that you've already received £165 million of taxpayers' money?
We have, and if we were to change the pricing, we would have had to either ask for higher subsidy or reduce coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't have anybody else indicating for questions, so just to thank you for the briefing this morning. It has been very useful to get the update, and if we have any additional questions, sure, we can forward them through either to the department or to Fibrus.
Right, thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee members.
Thank you.
Here I did have a couple of ones that perhaps would be worth processing, and I think maybe Mike, you had a couple that might be worth processing too.
What I'd suggest is going direct to Nigel. That's probably the most efficient. I think he suggested that was the most efficient way. So we can supply that contact detail, and I think if you go direct to him.
Can I just ask? Sorry, go ahead.
Just I don't want to bang on about customer satisfaction, but they do have from September last a satisfaction protocol where they say that if they see anything on the internet, they will be proactively, urgently and directly responding. That was introduced in the 2 months when my friend was waiting for a response to a direct email to Fibrus.
Sure, this will definitely be a legacy issue flag up, because obviously as PAC are doing the inquiry into, but on the back of the Audit Office's value for money report, they're doing an inquiry into that. And that'll allow us to pick up the data they've got, or the new committee to pick up the data they've got. But obviously, they're talking about the next quarter, they're introducing new satisfaction survey mechanisms, and obviously that's something I think the new committee will need to be picking up on, is seeing data on that, and also what other ways they're actually engaging with people. I don't know that we totally got a full understanding of that, but that's all going to be definitely legacy priorities.
Did we ask for a joint briefing of the department and Firmus, or was that the way it's presented to us?
No, we asked for that. We specifically wanted Firmus here, so that they could answer directly.
Not Firmus, Fibrus.
Fibrus, sorry, not Firmus.
Yeah. That's my fault. That was my fault.
Still on that gas thing,
I was thinking about Firmus earlier on. We asked for that specifically because we wanted them to be able to do. If you don't have them, and you don't get the chalk face answers. You know what I mean?
No, it's just one of
so
the
much the department can tell you.
It is, yeah, strange.
Okay.
So we'll move on then to our next briefing, which is item number 5.
5, yes. Chair.
And it's the briefing on the Employment 0 Hours Workers and Banded Weekly Working Hours Bill from NIC-ICTU. So there is a clerk's memo at page 49 of our pack There's a Hansard from the committee meeting of the 2nd of February at page 51, and then Retail NI's wellbeing plan that we asked for them to share with us is at page 55. So can I welcome to the meeting and apologise for keeping you waiting. Our previous briefing ran over there a little bit. So good morning, I think, yes, we are still morning, to Kevin Doherty, who is the Union Services Officer in NIC-ICTU, Patricia McCone, who is a NIC-ICTU member for Unison, and then Paul McFlynn, who is the co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute. So I hand over to yourselves to make an opening statement, and then we can bring members in for questions.
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting us to give evidence here today on what we regard as a very important bill. We will be following this up with a written submission shortly. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves as they speak, but first of all, I'm going to make a brief introduction to our position on the bill, and then Patricia will come in, followed by Paul. As you mentioned, Kiva, I'm an officer of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which is the trade union federation on the island of Ireland, representing the collective interests of 800,000 people, 200,000 of whom live and work in Northern Ireland. NIC-ICTU is the largest civic society organisation in Northern Ireland and is the voice of the trade union movement under the direction of NIC-ICTU's Northern Ireland Committee, or as we refer to it, NIC-ICTU. Although this bill is not a ban on zero-hours contracts, which the New Decade New Approach Agreement had promised, NIC-ICTU fully supports it. I have to say we have a concern with one aspect of the bill as currently drafted, which we will draw your attention to later in the hope that it can be suitably amended. But as I say, NIC-ICTU fully support the bill, as we believe it will have a positive impact on the lives of many vulnerable workers, including women, young and migrant workers, who tend to be disproportionately affected by zero-hours contracts. At the same time, it also maintains flexibility for employers. Not the flexibility to transfer risk to workers, exert unjustified control over them, and have them at the employer's beck and call, as is the situation in many cases today. This bill is a move in the direction of creating a more balanced, modern, flexible employment model where workers and employers can agree the type of flexibility that suits both parties. We regard the bill as timely, as it aims to bring Northern Ireland in line with the widely held view that the swing of the pendulum over at least the last 30 years towards increasing casualisation of working people's terms and conditions of employment, or growth and flexibility, depending on your perspective, has gone too far, with growing adverse social and economic consequences, such as a rise in in-work poverty, even where wages are supported by state benefits. The provisions within the bill fit within the new EU directive on transparent and predictable working conditions, which member states are currently transposing. The bill also chimes with the sentiments of Good Work, the Taylor Review of Modern Working Practices, which, as you're aware, was commissioned by a Conservative government. The report published in 2017, but unfortunately we're still awaiting the government's promised legislative response. And we have the example of the Republic of Ireland, where very similar legislation to that contained in this bill was introduced in 2018, with banded hours and compensations for workers called into work but not provided with any. It must be noted that the Republic saw no adverse economic consequences after this became law. Businesses did not close and employers did not dismiss workers. Flexibility in employment still exists. Those who wish to remain on non-guaranteed or zero-hours contracts can do so. Others who require a level of certainty about their income receive it by being granted guaranteed hours. I'm sure, like us, you can recall all of the dire warnings of economic doom that preceded the introduction of the national minimum wage in the UK. But after it was introduced, these warnings proved entirely false, and we believe it will be the same with this bill. As we can see from the example of the Republic of Ireland, introducing this bill will not damage good employers here. It will protect them. It will protect them from being undercut by unscrupulous employers who seek competitive advantage not through innovation or increases in productivity, but through reduced labour costs by exploiting their workers, regardless of the human costs to those workers and their families. The bill aims to create a level playing field, as well as guaranteeing a predictable income to workers currently forced to accept 0 hours contracts. Predictable income is probably the most important aspect of work, as it is the basis for planning life. Not knowing what you will be earning day to day can be a life lived in fear and anxiety, particularly if you have a family depending on your wage. In such a precarious lifestyle, you are unable to budget, unable to get a mortgage or get a bank loan. You struggle to pay bills and rent. You are unable to plan for life outside of work if you have childcare responsibilities, other current responsibilities. Fluctuating hours means it's difficult to claim in-work benefits, and many people, when they do get benefits, have them delayed. And in the workplace, you must take whatever work you're offered for fear that you won't be offered another shift. You suffer all sorts of mistreatment as you're afraid if you complain, the shifts will stop. This is the situation which many 0 hours contract workers find themselves in today in Northern Ireland. Between 2017 and 2020, NIC-ICTU, along with Ulster University, the Migrant Rights Centre Ireland, and the Community Intercultural Project based in Portadown, ran a Peace 4 project assisting vulnerable migrant workers, mainly in the agri-food sector here. The project was also supported by, which was also supported by the Executive Office, gathered evidence of the mistreatment and exploitation of large numbers of vulnerable newcomer migrant workers. They were vulnerable as they were new to the country. They were unaware of their rights. They had limited English and no family support, wider family support networks to fall back on when times got tight. By way of an example of the scale of the problem workers on 0 hours contracts face at the moment, we would wish to bring to your attention the experiences of migrant workers in one particular agri-food sector employer. And you will remember the scenes from the Elia Kazan film On the Waterfront, starring Marlon Brando, when dock workers gathered every morning at the gates in the hope of getting picked over their colleagues for a day's work. This film was made in 1954. Would it surprise you if I told you that a similar situation exists here today? Well, it does in this example of a food processor which employs over 200 workers, and most of them on 0 hours contracts. To get work, the employees check if their name is on a list posted on the wall in the workplace the day before. That's the first hurdle. If it is and you come into work, you then have to wait with your colleagues to be selected by supervisors to get a start. If you're not picked, you have to make your own way home with no pay. So you have a start time, but you don't know what time you're going to finish as you stop work whenever the supervisor tells you that the work is done for the day. So this blocks many women workers, many mothers who want to work but can't, because who's going to pick up their children at the end of the day? They don't know if they're going to be working when school finishes or when the creche finishes. So they just can't take a job in the workplace, which leaves families then reliant on one wage, and it's a national minimum wage pay and unpredictable hours. And that's how they survive. If the workers object, or if they take sick leave, then they're penalised by not being selected for work for a period of time after that. This, along with a minimal statutory sick pay payment of £96 per week, led to workers with COVID symptoms continuing to work to support their families. They had no choice. It was either that, take a risk of COVID, or to not be able to pay the rent or heat the house. This employer's business model risked the lives of the workforce and their families during the pandemic and increased discrimination between ethnic minorities in the workplace. We came across this employer when 60 workers were told there was no work for them just before Christmas in 2018. They were left without pay, struggling to pay their rent, heat, and feed their families. We had to go to charities to see if we could get money for heating oil for them and all sorts of food packages and support. They didn't want to take cases to tribunals because the employer had told them that work would start again soon, and that if they took a case, then they wouldn't be picked for this employment coming up. The passing of this bill will help to stop this scandal in workplaces here. The agri-food sector is not the only place where 0 hours contracts are being misused and turned into a normal business model. They are rife in hospitality and leisure, and in healthcare, which Patricia will touch on next, and even now in the education sector. As I mentioned at the start, we have a concern with the current wording of the bill. At clause 14, it states that if a 0 hours contract worker is placed on a band, then they are no longer defined as 0 hours workers. But if this is the case, then according to the bill, they will no longer be protected from the ban on exclusivity clauses or compensated for being called into work and not being given any hours. If this remains the case, then you could have a worker placed on a band, conceivably the lower bands, 3 to 6 hours, called into work on a particular day, and then denied hours when they arrive, while those who chose to remain in 0 hours contracts are given work. This could be used by bad employers to penalise those workers who seek to access the protections of this bill. We would ask the committee to look at amending the bill to close this potential loophole. I would now like to hand over to Patricia, who will be followed by Paul, and I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Happy for me to come in now, Chair?
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you very much. I'm Patricia McKeown. I'm a member of the Northern Committee of ICTU and Regional Secretary of Unison. We are the largest union in the social care sector, and this is the sector in which 0 hours is particularly predominant at the moment. We've made extensive policy submissions and bargaining interventions over the years on social care. We're just about to do that again on the current consultation on adult social care. We have extensive experience of handling what are now called 0 hours contracts in social care. In the 80s and the 90s, the majority of care workers were directly employed by the health service, and the majority of those were employed on casual contracts. Today we call that 0 hours. That had a major adverse impact on retention, workforce planning, care standards, and the quality and the quantum of care delivered. Through collective bargaining, we introduced guaranteed working hours, which I think is not dissimilar to the banding proposals in this bill, but that took years longer than it should have done. A legislative base would have made the difference. However, with the emergence of outsourcing of social care, 0 hours has become the predominant arrangement in social care provided by contractors. Now, there are no proper collective bargaining arrangements to tackle it, although we have a commitment from the Minister for Health on our proposal to establish a social care forum. We've got the terms of reference, but the forum hasn't met yet. But this bill is a necessary baseline for that work. 0 hours creates major problems for workers, for clients, for unions and for employers. We've returned to the problems on retention, workforce planning, care standards, quality and quantum of care. The use of 0 hours has always created a very high attrition rate across this sector. The pandemic has exacerbated this. Many care workers in the sector in particular simply moved on. Less risk, better pay. At a time when we know the commitments on social care mean that we've got to expand. Remarkably, it's 12 years since the publication of Fair Society, Healthy Lives, the groundbreaking Marmot review into health inequality in England. The review findings were endorsed by the Health Service here. Of the 6 key recommendations to tackle growing health inequality across society, 2 of them are creating fair employment and good work for all, and ensuring a healthy standard of living for all. Professor Marmot gave social care as a particular example in that review, summarising quality care results are achieved by the decent treatment of the social care workforce. Or as my granny used to say, you get what you pay for. Today we have a 2-tier workforce delivering a critical component of healthcare in an area that has to expand. So this bill can start to take us in the right direction on those 2 core Marmot recommendations, not only in social care, but across all sectors. And when you look at Marmot, you realise that this is not solely about workers in work at the moment. This is about the future of the workforce and the future of individuals and groups of people in our society. If we're ever going to turn around health inequalities, the 2 are intimately linked. I'm very happy to take any questions the committee may have and hand over to Paul McFlynn.
Okay, good morning everyone, and once again thanks for having me here to talk today. As Kevin mentioned, I'm co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute, and we are a independent research body funded by the trade union movement. A sort of central plank of our work has been examining what we've come to determine, to come to name precarious work. And zero hours contracts is one element of that sort of suite of precarious work, which has grown in prevalence in recent years, in particular pockets and areas of our labour market. I think, well, we don't have much in the way of reliable historical data on zero hours contracts, and sort of as Patricia was mentioning earlier, the idea of casual contracts, what we used to call zero hours contracts. We can say that there was a noticeable step change after the financial crisis, where we did see an increase, a market increase in these types of contracts within the UK. As measured by the ONS. Like as the bill sets out, we do know that approximately somewhere in the range of between 1.5% and 2% of employees in Northern Ireland are employed on zero hours contracts. But it is worth noting that the data that we use from that has a checkered history. And is still being updated as recently as last week. A new method of attempting to calculate zero hours contracts has been put in place. Biggest problems there is a lot of people who are on zero hours contracts didn't know they were on zero hours contracts. They probably referred to them as casual contracts. And as Kevin referred to, given the prevalence of zero hours contracts for groups of workers, particularly migrants, they are sometimes groups that are too often beyond the reach of the sample that the Office for National Statistics used to make their calculation. But I think the one thing that we can say is that that when we look at the UK regions, Northern Ireland does have the lowest prevalence of zero hours contracts. That in and of itself can be seen as a good thing, but when we look at where zero hours contracts tend to occur within the economy, we know that the biggest predictor of zero hours contracts is the size of the firm involved in the employment, and because Northern Ireland has a much up to, in terms of half the level of employment in large firms, 250 employees and over, that this means that the structure of Northern Ireland's labour market sort of means it was always sort of predestined to have a lower incidence of zero hours contracts. But if you adjusted Northern Ireland to make it look slightly more like other regions, you would likely see that increase. But I think it does speak to the broader point here that just because there is a lower level of zero hours contracts at present does not mean that situation will continue into the future. If anything, there are greater risks of an increase in zero hours contracts usage within the Northern Ireland economy. Patricia alluded to one of them already, the fact that because zero hours contracts are very common in areas like social care, that is what we forecast to be one of the biggest growth areas in employment over the next number of years. But also, generally, if we are hoping that Northern Ireland's productivity is going to improve, a key aspect of that is going to be moving to larger firms and them having a greater role in our economy. So the risk is definitely there. And the final point I want to make is that the transitions, because it's possibly not as well known that the majority of people aren't hired on zero hours contracts. People tend to transition to a zero hours contract with their same employer, in many cases with the same employer for up to 2 years before they transition onto a zero hours contract. And we're currently finding our way through one of the biggest labour market disruptions we faced in the last number of years due to the pandemic, and we're staring down at the next big change that's going to be necessary in terms of adapting to climate change. And within that great churn within the labour market, it does heighten the risk of these transitions to zero hours contracts becoming more prevalent. So. Yes, the prevalence is lower in Northern Ireland, but there is an opportunity here to shut the barn door before the horse bolts. So, but thank you very much for hearing me out. And once again, I'm happy to answer questions with the group afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, all three of you, for the briefings. And I think the issues that you have set out in relation to this bill and I guess the broader labour market have been really useful to us, and in particular in relation to why this bill is required, and why that this was a commitment within New Decade, New Approach, along with the others, employment and workers' rights commitments that we want to see brought forward as quickly as possible. I think the example, Kevin, that you give in relation to that employer is a scandal, and that could persist in this modern economy and society is nothing short of scandalous, and highlights why this legislation is necessary. I think, Patricia, you have laid out very clearly why these types of contracts are a barrier to the type of recruitment and retention of staff that you want to see in a really important sector like health and social care, and I think that again highlights the importance of this piece of legislation, and Paul, in relation to the improving our productivity, which is obviously something that is really important to like broader economic well-being and development, and workers' terms and conditions are clearly a key part of that. Kevin, you alluded to the issue in relation to that loophole, as you've described it, in relation to the protection of workers who are currently on zero hours contracts, and ensuring that would carry over to them when they're on banded hour contracts. And I know you have raised that with Gemma as well, and that she is open to looking at that. So obviously, if the committee can take a look at that issue, we'd be happy to do so, and we will look specifically at some sort of wording that might be necessary to correct that particular issue. I suppose just a question, and it's probably to all three of you, but in relation to the experience in the south where they did bring in the legislation, and the experience of both workers and employers in respect of that legislation as has been introduced, and how that has impacted.
Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of we don't have anything in the way of hard data, because we had probably about a year before we went into the pandemic, and everything went a bit haywire. But no, I think the key for the bill in the South was that it still preserves, as this bill does, the right the right of somebody who wants a 0 hours contract and to have a 0 hours contract, and it sets out a very limited set of conditions where that should be made available. And I think it overcomes possibly what was the central objection to this, that there are some workers who do want the flexibility that 0 hours contracts offer, but that this is constraining no one, but is setting a new sort of minimum set of rights, as Kevin alluded to, like the minimum wage, just a new floor below which nobody has to fall. But in terms of the immediate impacts, there's no discernible, either at lower sectoral levels within the Irish labour market, of any impact of it. I think it was well flagged beforehand. There was a great deal of consultation, and it came as a surprise to nobody. And as in many of these cases, what happened was the labour market adjusts and continues on.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to bring in Peter for a question.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose maybe just 3 points I want to, and maybe that to some extent you've touched on the first point, but it may be useful if rather than, feel free to give a verbal response, but maybe it's maybe more by way of written information. We had also a bit of evidence from a previous session in terms of the broad prevalence of 0 hours contract within different sectors. I know Patricia has touched upon the public sector side of it, mentions made of the agriculture sector, but we'd also had evidence which said, for example, that the usage of 0 hours contract was something that was now very rare within the retail sector, for instance, outside of broader hospitality, and had kind of become regarded as such poor practice that it was effectively bit by bit disappearing from that sector. I appreciate the point that's been made that there's a certain level of caveat that's got to be put to the data, because it's difficult to verify the exact accuracy of it. But I wonder, because again, I think it'd be helpful to us in our deliberations as well, if you do have data of a breakdown of both obviously the mentions being about the 1.5% to 2%, but of the drill down with the data of the prevalence within various sectors of the levels of usage of 0 hours contract, and if there's any sort of statistics around that you can, albeit with a certain level of health warning around that. I think that would be helpful. Don't know if that's maybe something you could just indicate you could send to us. Rather, possibly there may not be an enormous amount of point in getting saying much more verbally today on that particular point. The first point, just.
In terms of the data, we wouldn't have sectoral breakdowns for Northern Ireland, purely because the sample size that's used by the ONS here is too small for it to be statistically significant. There is a very detailed UK-wide breakdown, and not a huge amount of evidence to suggest why it would be significantly different here in Northern Ireland once you make a few minor adjustments for broad industrial structure.
I think from that point of view, even any evidence that you can provide, even with that slight level of caveat, that it would be useful. Second point, I suppose, picking up, I suppose, in terms of the issue had been raised about the potential for a loophole in terms of the shift towards banded hours contracts. I can see, and I think, certainly I don't think anybody would want to see unintentional loopholes getting created. And I can see potentially the issue there of the cancellation protection, if I can put it that way, and there would be danger there. And while I wouldn't want to see any loophole opened up, just on the issue of the exclusivity, because I think everybody would be very much on the same page that we want to see exclusivity banned in that regard. But I've heard reference at times to exclusivity on 0 hours contracts. I suppose sometimes at very high levels of employment. I've seen where there's a particular specialism, and it's somebody who is a permanent employee who is, a very specialist, but I've seen some level of exclusivity. I wouldn't particularly be aware of exclusivity having happened within banded contracts. I'm just wondering, has there been any particular experience you've found of that? While appreciating that under any circumstances, we don't want to create the sort of an odd loophole that exclusivity, that there would be that issue would be different between the two sectors. Just in terms of banded contracts, have you had particular experience of there being exclusivity issues with banded contracts? Because obviously we've seen it with 0 hours contracts. I'm just wondering, to some extent, are we seeing is there danger of seeing a problem which doesn't actually exist there?
I'm not sure if the exclusivity clause applies in the South. I'm looking to Paul here in terms of the legislation. I know that's something that was identified in the Taylor Review, and in 2015 it had been blocked. Legislation was introduced to ban the use of exclusivity clauses. But so we don't have banded hours here yet, so I can't really comment on that at this stage. But just going back to your point on the retail sector, yeah, there had been moves by the larger retail firms to move away from 0 hours contracts, and there are guaranteed minimum hours. I think 8 hours is the lowest. And then there's top-up hours provided through overtime, and it's a type of banded system that has been introduced within the retail sector voluntarily. But the purpose of this legislation, if it's passed, is that it will stop those who seek to work below that level. We need to use a bit of a stick to make sure that unscrupulous employers come into line with the good employers.
Yeah, I suppose the final question. Sorry. Don't know if was somebody else trying to come in there, just or?
I think it might have been the echo.
A wee bit of sound interference.
I appreciate there's maybe a wee bit of echo, so it maybe creates a little bit of problem. Yeah, I suppose just to pick up the final point, the final point just I want to raise on the concern, because I think, again, just one of the issues was we'd all want to create a situation where good employers are protected, but unscrupulous employers are prevented from abusive position in that regard. I suppose one of the difficulties that is there in terms of tackling as a route forward, obviously the route which is proposed via the bill is that there is to reach a sort of a banded position, and that obviously has got to be some level of evidence of what hours have been worked up to that point, of a sort of a 3-month qualification period really to then be able to transfer to the banded side of things. And there may not be a great way of getting around that. I suppose one concern I would have a little bit with that is there or do you have any concerns that it potentially could almost reward unscrupulous employers who then see that the qualification period as being a point at which they then move their 0 hours activities into sort of a sphere where they sort of very casualise their employees, i.e. we'll take so-and-so on, but we'll only really retain them for 2 or 2.5 months, so they don't ever reach the threshold in that regard and get a much more greater level of churn. And those who would therefore use those sort of very potentially unscrupulous activities are effectively then don't have to worry about the requirements of the bill, but those who are actually better employers, who are actually looking for much longer term relationship with their employees, are then sort of subject to. So is there any concern that it could that there's a slight inadvertent danger of incentivising to some extent slightly unscrupulous employers?
You raise a fair point, and it is a point that has been recognised in the Taylor Review, and legislation has been passed across the water, and we're playing catch up. That moves that a break in employment. At the moment, it sits here that if the employer breaks the employees work for a week, then it's resetting the clock. But they've moved with the Taylor Review to 1 month across the water, and we would like to see that catch up here, which should hopefully close that loophole you're correctly identifying. Where there's a lot of things, there's a lot of pieces of legislation that we need to catch up on here. There's also this piece of legislation on its own will not solve problems. The other commitments in the new decade approach, particularly around collective bargaining, we believe will be key to stopping exploitation in the workplace, and we'll be keen to see the commitments from the new decade approach carried through into the next programme for government. But it is a fair point you raise, and we need to catch up with the legislation across the water.
Again, I don't know if there's examples elsewhere. Again, just thinking off the top of my head a little bit as well. Is there any route also for clearly, if you're talking about a 3-month trigger period, that say within a period of a 12-month period that the clock doesn't have to start again from the start? I'm conscious if you get a point at which somebody is hired for 2 months, then basically told, well, actually, we're not going to need you, that's the end of your contract, and then rehired a month down the line for another couple of months on that basis, so that the thing could be cumulative in some word over a particular set period of time type of thing. Maybe that, again, just speculating as well, that might be one of the areas of doing that. That probably just maybe more of a comment than a question, so Chair, I'll hand back to yourself.
Okay, thanks, Peter. No, I think it is an area that we need to take a look at, and maybe not for this bill specifically, but in wider employment law. Mike?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your engagement. I would say I would be instinctively supportive of the bill, because as the point's been well made, it doesn't ban 0 hours, but what it does try to do is ban employers imposing 0 hours contracts on employees. I was going to ask about the last point that Peter Weir made, which is that, at that factory gate on the waterfront that Kevin referenced, there's nothing in my mind that stops an unscrupulous employer saying, I'll employ Kevin for the first 2 months, then I'll switch to Patricia, then I'll go to Paul, then I'll go to somebody else. So just to expand on that, Kevin, you talked about 200 workers at that food processors. What happens if we abolish the 0 hours? What happens to those who get excluded? If I, as the employer, only need 100, so that there are 100 who are getting banded employment, but there's 100 who are getting nothing.
It's a difficult one to answer, Mike. There is a change in the situation here at the moment where with Brexit and the lack of migrant workers coming to the country, we can see labour force shortages. Now, these labour force shortages are encouraging employers to do what they can to retain workers. So that might have an impact upon it. You're raising questions. Again, I think, this bill will not solve all problems, but it's a step in the right direction. And along with other commitments in the new decade new approach, I think it'll allow trade unions and it'll allow access to workers who are facing this current exploitation. But the things have changed slightly with the new dynamic in the economy after Brexit, and I think we could be overthinking problems that may not be there. But it's a fair point.
Okay.
Chair, could I come in on that one for a moment as well?
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, legislation, as Kevin says, won't solve everything. But there are other key routes. The first for us is collective bargaining. So the ability to go in and do business with employers on the other side of the table to make sure that we establish the right rights And the second, which is quite a comprehensive area at the minute, particularly when you think about areas like social care, is the monitoring in public procurement. So, you know, we would expect that in any of the instances where major public money is being expended, and social care, we're talking multi-million pound, that the conditions would be written into the contracts, the procurement contracts between client and contractor in the first instance, and that honouring their legal obligations and the policy of a public service would be an element of that. In addition to it being an area where there is comprehensive collective bargaining. So therefore, there would be workforce monitoring coming from that perspective as well. So there are a number of things here that need to happen to you know, have a holistic approach to get to that place that Marmot is talking about, you know, on decent work, fair remuneration, enough money to live on, tackling health inequalities. There are a number of issues. This doesn't solve them all. Right. It's a stepping stone on the way.
Okay, that's very clear. It's not a panacea, but there's no reason not to support it because of that. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I don't have anybody else indicating to come in for questions. So, look, thank you very much for your time. It has been a really useful briefing. It has offered us some important perspective in a range of areas, and will really help us in terms of the scrutiny of this bill. And as I said, Kevin, we're happy to take a look at that particular issue that you've raised, and obviously we'll look forward to the written submission as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so do we need to agree anything out of that?
Chair, we'll just follow up, if members are content, we'll follow up on that issue around clause 14 yes. And see, might be worth actually us contacting the proposer to see if she has some ideas about what she's already thinking of in terms of that. So if members are content, we'll go ahead and see what's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Chair, again, I don't know whether through the Assembly as well on that basis, is there any kind of legal clarification that could be got just on that as well? Yep. And what I mean by that is that I don't think anybody wants to see an inadvertent loophole, but I think there also may be a site, and maybe this is just a question of tweaking the wording, or maybe, to be honest, to be fair, the wording is fine the way it is. But I suppose if there's any level of interpretation of whether that would cover the situation, you know, on that side of things, it may be useful to get a little bit of advice on that from the drafting point of view. On that.
Sure, we'll probably roll that into the query with the proposer as to whether or not they've already looked at the legal side of that. If not, we can go for legal advice.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to move on then to item number 6, which is the briefing from RAISE on the Company Law Common Framework. There is a letter from the Chair of the Common Framework Scrutiny Committee to BES at page 76 of our packs, and then the RAISE briefing paper is at page 79. So can we bring into the spotlight, please, Aidan Stennett from RAISE, and if I hand over to yourself, Aidan, to make an opening statement just around your paper, and apologies for keeping you waiting because we're running a wee bit behind this morning.
No worries, Chair. I'm going to share my screen and run through a quick presentation. If I go on too long, please tell me to stop. So hopefully you can see that. No, not. Okay. So as you mentioned, Chair, I'm going to talk to you today about the Company Law Common Framework. I'm really going to look at this in two ways. First of all, I'm going to talk about just common frameworks in general, what their purpose is, and some considerations arising from that. And then we'll move on to look at the common framework, the Company Law Common Framework itself specifically, and some specific considerations that are emerging out of that. Just to say at the outset, whilst there's a good deal of information on common frameworks in general, information about this specific common framework, the Company Law Common Framework, is rather limited, and really for this paper I've been forced to draw on mainly just the provisional Company Law Common Framework document itself. Okay, so what are common frameworks and why are they here? Well, prior to the UK's exit from the EU law, help to create UK-wide approaches to policy in certain areas. Following the UK's exit from the EU, powers in these areas have returned to the UK. Some of those powers intersect with devolved competences, and common frameworks are now being developed to ensure a common approach to policy across the UK is possible while allowing for divergence. So there's three principles underpinning common frameworks which have been agreed by the UK government and devolved administrations. So these are fully outlined on page 81, 82 of your packs. But just briefly, they set out the circumstances under which a common framework should be introduced. That's number one. Number two, they require that a common framework is to respect devolution settlements, including providing that they should lead to a significant increase in decision-making powers for devolved administrations. And thirdly, a common framework should recognise the social linkages between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and adhere to the Belfast/Good Friday Agreement. So there's a 5-step process to developing a common framework. The company law one is at step 4, which allows for each Parliament in the UK to scrutinise it at the same time. And page 83 of the packs fully outlines the other 4 steps. And just to give you some context, there's 152 areas of former EU law that have been identified with intersecting with devolved competencies. 120 of those were found to be requiring no further action. 29 were identified as non-legislative, and 3 have been categorised as legislative action being required. Just to note that these numbers are fluid. So previously, when I looked at this, there was 115 requiring no further action. There were fewer non-legislative ones and 18 legislative ones, and these changes are the result of ongoing collaboration and discussions between the UK government and the devolved administrations. So looking at some of the general considerations that emerge out from the process that will apply to all common frameworks to a greater or lesser degree. So first of all, given that the common frameworks have those 3 underlying principles that I outline, it stands to reason that they should be consistent with those. So this is something the committee may wish to explore more with the department or with stakeholders as it scrutinises the company law common framework. So the Northern Ireland Protocol may become significant in certain common frameworks. Essentially, as the committee will be aware, the protocol has led to the continued application of certain areas of EU law within Northern Ireland, but not within GB. So that may place limits on how common a common framework can be. Now, with regards to the company law common framework, the Whitehall Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, in setting out the provisional company law common framework, has stated that there are no identified interactions with the protocol. However, if those should arise, they will be dealt with under the common framework's own internal review and amendment processes, which I'll come back to later on in the presentation. Then there's also the Internal Market Act. So essentially the Internal Market Act has been introduced and it includes what are called market access principles. There's 2 principles, one on mutual recognition and the other on non-discrimination. And these are designed to ensure that a product created in one area of the UK can be placed on the market of the rest of the UK. Now, when the Act was being going through Parliament, there was some consternation amongst the devolved administrations, particularly Scotland, who argued that these market access principles constrain the competences of the devolved legislatures, and that it should be the common frameworks that should be used to govern the UK internal market. Now, as a consequence of this, the Act is enacted includes provisions that allow the Secretary of State to pass legislation to exclude a policy area from the market access principles where a common framework exists. So that's so the consequence for this, for the company law common framework, is that we don't know, based on the information available, whether this is such a a common framework where this secondary legislation is required to exclude it from the Internal Markets Act, market access principles. So again, there's something here that may be worth exploring with the department or other stakeholders. Okay, sorry. So there's an issue with scrutiny and particularly ongoing scrutiny. So this was something that's been raised by the House of Lords Committee on this the House of Lords Common Frameworks Scrutiny Committee. So basically, they've argued that common frameworks are living documents in that they'll set up ongoing processes that will govern working relationships between devolved and central government. And they're also documents that will be subject to review and amendment going forward. So therefore, they are entities that should have continue to be scrutinised even after they're finalised. And they've recommended that the devolved administrations provide regular updates to the legislatures. Now, this is something that the UK government has agreed with, but has noted that the specifics were a matter for the individual departments. Now, there's nothing in the provisional company law common framework as currently drafted that addresses the scrutiny issue. So again, it's something the committee may wish to tease out. Moving on, again, coming from the House of Lords Committee, there's the issue of stakeholder consultation. So essentially, they have criticised the stakeholder consultation process, saying there was a lack of stakeholder consultation, and also criticising the transparency of the process. And they've argued for ongoing consultation as a common frameworks develop. So the UK government, on the contrary, has argued that a wide range of stakeholders have been consulted and agreed with the principle of ongoing consultation, particularly as these are being finalised and when they come to review and amendment. With the company law common framework, there's no indication from within the provisional document about who has been consulted, on what basis, and what did they say about this. So again, that's something the committee may wish to further tease out. So one of, as I mentioned at the start, there's three principles. One of those includes the idea that the common framework should lead to an increase in decision-making powers for devolved administrations. That has the potential to increase costs for the devolved administrations and lead to financial implications. It's not clear what the situation is with this common framework. Again, there's a lack of information in the supporting documents, so we don't know if there are any financial implications, and if there are, how they are to be funded. So moving on to the specific company law common framework. So company law is devolved to Northern Ireland, but the UK government has historically legislated on a UK-wide basis with the consent of the executive. So the company law common framework is non-legislative. It sets out non-legally binding working practices between the UK and the Northern Ireland executive in the area of company law. Essentially, it doesn't introduce anything new. Rather, it's a continuation of business as usual. So the existing relationship is to continue, though that will be formalised through an exchange of letters from the DFE Minister and the BES Minister. It's a non-legally binding agreement that's underpinned by 7 principles. These are fully outlined on page 95 of your packs, but essentially they include things like future updates on legislative or policy developments will be shared through parties. Parties will consider the impact of decisions on the other party, and parties will seek to resolve issues at the lowest possible level. From an operational perspective, BES is to consult with and regularly update DFE, and DFE is to provide commentary and facilitate wider executive views where those views are necessary. It also sets out mechanisms for monitoring, review and amendment, as well as dispute resolution, and I'll turn to those on the next slide. So some specific considerations arising from the company law common framework. The committee may wish to consider whether the level of formality is appropriate. As I mentioned, it's a non-legally binding agreement that formalises an existing approach through an exchange of letters between ministers. the committee may also wish to consider whether the review and amendment processes are appropriate and potentially detailed enough. So, according to the provisional common law, common framework, when finalised, it is to be reviewed every 3 years, and that the outcome of these reviews may result in the amendment and update of the non-legally binding agreement. Additionally, either party may also request ad hoc reviews at any point an issue arises. Here, there's a lack of clarity about what an issue is and what level of severity it needs to be at to result in an ad hoc review. Finally, the committee may also wish to consider the appropriateness of the dispute resolution procedures. So, the provisional document states that enforcement measures are not deemed appropriate for this common framework, and it then sets out escalation provisions. So, if you can see in this diagram, we start off at the lowest level, the official level. That works. If there's no agreement, that works up to senior level. There's no agreement, we go up to ministerial level. If there's no agreement there, then it's escalated to the appropriate intergovernmental structure. And this is where the provisional company law common framework stops. However, if we look at the UK government's recently published review on intergovernment relations, this sets out further escalation processes up to what's known as the Intergovernmental Council, which will consist of the Prime Minister and the heads of the devolved administrations. So I'll stop there, Chair. Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
No, thanks for that, Aidan. That's really helpful. And the broader sense of common frameworks as well as this specific one. Peter, just in terms of our process now.
So, Chair, we're in a position where we've agreed to scrutinise this common framework and the late payments policy common framework. So we have a period within which to do that I think takes us to the 20-something of March. So essentially the briefing we've had and any responses we get from stakeholders will help to inform the committee as to a decision it wants to make on whether it supports the common framework or not. What Aidan has highlighted has also been very helpfully highlighted in the letter from Baroness Andrews, who's chair of the Common Framework Scrutiny Committee. And those would be the exact issues that I would be highlighting to the committee, where there are problems around process, the operation of process, the non-legally binding nature, the satisfactory issue of whether or not exchange of letters is enough, etc. So those are all issues that we would want to flag up with the department in terms of the scrutiny that the committee would do. We'd apply the same with the late payments. So in hearing from Aidan today and any of the stakeholder responses, members will come to a conclusion as to whether or not they can support this or what issues they want to raise.
So the scrutiny points that Aidan has highlighted in his paper, will we feed
very
through
similar,
to
yeah, we feed
the
it through the
department
department.
and similarly stakeholders' reviews? Okay, and obviously the dispute resolution one was one that's highlighted by Aidan and also in the letter.
Baroness Andrews' letter, yeah.
Okay, I don't have any question for you, Aidan, but John does.
Just clarify a point for me, Aidan. You said during the latter part of your presentation, nothing has changed. So if nothing has changed, what are we scrutinising?
That's an interesting question. It's a continuation of existing working relationships. Where there is a change is that these working relationships will now be formalised through an exchange of letters. One thing the committee may wish to consider is, if we go back to the underlying principles, is whether that equates to a significant increase in powers for the devolved administration.
Our reduction in powers for the devolved administrations would be more of a concern for me. I wouldn't be able to comment on whether it's an increase or a reduction, but it seems to be a continuation of existing practices formalised through an exchange of letters. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I suppose what's highlighted in the paper as well is this is kind of a living document or a living arrangement. So in terms of the formal nature of that, I guess it is trying to understand how you can feed into it or decide when to feed into it, and as you highlighted in relation to those reviews. So I think those are things that we can take away.
Those are all issues that already the Common Frameworks Committee has identified, and I think you'll find they're common across all of the common frameworks that aren't based in legislation, the non-legally binding ones, the the late payments policy one being the same. There's no legislative framework around that, and that's going to be a consistent issue. If you don't have a legally binding framework, then all of those mechanisms for evolution, discussion, dispute, in our case, where there may well be future interface with the protocol as EU company law continues to change and impacts on us, you need really robust mechanisms to deal with that, and you can see why those have all been highlighted in the letter that Baroness Andrews has sent, and also those would be the issues that also Aidan has realised or has raised, and ones that I would be advising the committee that they need clarification on. Time is going to be our biggest problem on this, and the nature of what this is also trying to get then stakeholder responses. We've been struggling a little bit on that because it's a nuanced issue that is new to people, the idea of a common framework, whereas before everything was covered under EU regulations, directives and law, and that was universal, and that was the way it was. Now with the transference of that from Brussels to London, you've got the new complexity of London's control means that the issue of what is devolved comes into play, whereas it didn't before if this was coming from Brussels, because we were all part of that Brussels mechanism. We all do the things the way Brussels did, and that to a certain extent superseded the devolved settlement. Now with this being at London level, the devolved administrations are having to agree to issues that would be devolved competences, so you're creating networks across all the regions here that previously would have been governed by Brussels. So it's that new complexity of bringing it to the local level raises the issues around devolution and the interaction between London and the devolved administrations that simply didn't exist before, because everything was done at Brussels level, and we accepted those regulations as part of EU membership. So it's trying to put into a process what was more, if I can put it was a lot less complex when it was Brussels and it was EU wide, and there wasn't that same interface between UK government and devolved administrations. That's the new complexity, I suppose, really here, and that's why the issues around dispute resolution process, not having a legally binding framework, are so much more important, because before that just didn't exist. Those issues simply weren't there.
Okay.
Aidan, I don't have any other questions for you, so you're getting off light.
Till the next
Thank
time.
you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Peter, so we're going to skip matters arising and
Yes, Chair.
do it by correspondence. Okay. Members are happy enough to do that and move straight on to item number 8, which is the Onshore Fracking Prohibition Bill. Obviously, members will be well aware that there is limited time left in this mandate, and will have seen the letter from the Speaker yesterday evening, and we had a wee bit of a discussion there just this morning before we started the actual meeting. So if members are content, I would talk to the bill proposer about her own intentions in relation to taking the bill forward, given what the Speaker outlined yesterday. And Peter, then do you want to outline potentially where that would leave the committee?
So we are in a position, Chair, where the timescales are such that this fracking bill is not going to complete committee stage to allow subsequent stages to take place. We have it until I think the day before our final meeting.
That was the day of the final meeting.
The day of the final meeting is essentially where committee stage ends, and as I previously indicated, the 30-day statutory period is not really adequate. We've already had a little bit of I think fair criticism of the very short survey and call for evidence timescale we applied on 0 hours of 3 weeks. This one would actually end up being 2 weeks. I've talked to a number of colleagues, and there's a significant amount of precedent here where the committee may well wish to dispense with a survey and call for evidence because it might be seen as a little bit it gives a false impression as well as being incredibly short, that will go somewhere, that there will be a circular process where those views will end up somewhere they won't be able to in this mandate. And I think that would be putting a lot of pressure on stakeholders to turn around something incredibly fast that isn't going anywhere. So there's plenty of precedent, and it's in the committee's decision as to whether or not they wish to proceed with a survey and call for evidence, because we would always seek permission for those anyway. Leading from there, I'd also be asking the committee if it would be content to reserve its position on the bill, as the committee did with small-scale green energy, because of the time scale and because other issues need to be explored. And where that would kind of leave the committee is the, I suppose, core oral evidence. So we would seek oral evidence from the department, and again, that would give their view on this issue and allow them to clarify again what fracking is and so on, because I think it's still there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what the process is out there. Have the bill sponsor come and talk about the purpose of the bill, and ultimately also be able to give an indication of where they see things sitting, and having a briefing from RAISE, where again it's more likely to be the factual around, you know, the bill, what it is, what it does, and how it changes things, and what it can't touch or what it doesn't touch. And that would be published in a curtailed bill report that is massively caveated, in that it's simply, here's a presentation of evidence, the committee reserves its position, there is no call for evidence presented, there is no survey data presented, and this is to facilitate discussion in a further mandate around, you know, bringing back this bill or a similar bill, or something that could come from the department as well. So it puts it very clearly out there what the committee is able to do, that it's reserving its position because its process has been very much truncated and there simply hasn't been time to follow through to a degree where the committee could stand behind a scrutinised bill and claim this was that. And it's simply a presentation then of the evidence that that the committee has managed within the time scale to gather. And that's what the precedents and discussion I've had with other clerks has kind of led us to. Ultimately, everything is for the committee to decide and agree on. But if members want to give their views, Chair.
Okay, so we'd be asking members to agree that we would not do a survey and call for evidence in the bill, given that it could create a false impression, that we would reserve the committee's position on the bill, so we wouldn't be doing clause by clause, and also that in the interim between now and next week, I will speak to the bill sponsor about what she wants to do in light of what the Speaker has said.
Chair, we already have, as we would always do, we've scheduled, so we've scheduled the department, we've scheduled the proposer, and we've scheduled RAISE. If the department, or sorry, if the committee is happy enough to go with that core evidence gathering, which will be without, in the absence of stakeholder input, will simply be factual on largely about what fracking is and what the bill would do with regard to fracking.
Anybody have any?
That sounds like a plan.
Chair, I mean, yeah, seems a reasonable sort of way. I suppose the only question I want to ask a little bit in relation to that, and I appreciate it, it wouldn't, I suspect, be added to in terms of increased, but what the approach of the bill sponsor. Just wondering in terms of the approach, and I don't want to get too much into what's been said, would there need to be potentially some level of re-evaluation next week, depending upon what the bill sponsor has said? What I mean by that is that if, and like, I don't know, if for the sake of argument she said, actually, in terms of timescale, because this isn't going anywhere, I'm not going to proceed with it, does that
change our...
Well, no, because it's reached committee now. It's in the committee's hands. The bill sponsor's role, I guess, picks up again at the end of committee stage, when they would be seeking to schedule consideration stage, which now obviously cannot happen because the committee stage will finish on the last committee day, which is also likely to be the last possible day where there could be a plenary anyway, but none of the timescales are workable.
It's just more on the basis that I was content with the sort of the route forward, or just whether we were almost having to make a provisional decision then, which may be altered by what's said.
So the decisions are essentially those that are available will be the committee's gift to decide. Where the difference may be is if the bill sponsor decided they didn't want to come and present to committee, and obviously that's for them to decide. We have a provisional date, but as I say, following your discussion, they may wish to change that.
Okay.
Just to clarify on Peter's point, following your conversation with the bill sponsor, and the bill sponsor says, look, I'm not moving ahead, the committee could decide next week, well, look, if the bill sponsor's not moving ahead or stalling the bill, there's not much point in us doing it anymore.
Yeah, and you could essentially then just, the raised paper's being drafted, but, because we always seek for that anyway, but absolutely, the committee need do nothing more if it chose to then say we reserve our position and we won't be gathering any evidence. Chair, Mr. O'Toole.
Sorry, Chair, thank you. So, I mean, I think it's worth just being clear about that we aren't going to, when we could decide to do a report, I suppose, but it seemed completely reasonable for RAISE to do a report, and for that will be online, that will exist for a future. Are any evidence we gathered effectively what we would be doing? Because in all probability, even if everyone in this room is returned to the Assembly, it's highly possible we won't be, unlikely it would seem that this committee will have precisely the same composition, and that we would be, we don't obviously know that the same bill sponsor would be here or want to take her own bill forward, so what we would effectively be doing is creating Hansard content for people to, and I don't mean that in a cynical way, I just mean that I'm not,
The flip side of that is it also, depending on timescales, allows a successor committee to move a bit faster.
Right.
Because RAISE would have already commented, especially if the bill is very similar. You would also have a fairly good understanding and record then of the fracking process as the department sees it, and the bill sponsor's intention, if you went ahead with those three briefings. The content of a bill report on that basis would be committee reserves its position, therefore no clause by clause. Here's what we've gathered and here's what the bill says. So you would still have a production of work that could then be picked up by the next committee, and it might just allow them to shorten the process. It also provides a record of clearly what we have or haven't done. And in that respect, I suppose there's some value, but I take on board exactly.
It would be a new committee though who might be totally uninformed about fracking, and then themselves want to do their own basic homework. And
Chair, just probably not something we've actually really come across before. I appreciate, just interested enough in terms of RAISE, whether it's this subject or any other subject. I appreciate that probably there would be effectively a restriction if they were doing work that they're not going to publish anything during the period which the Assembly isn't sitting. On that basis, because that takes us a little bit even just on a minor way into PERDA. I'm just wondering on the basis, because presumably if for the sake of argument RAISE, beyond any issue, started a piece of work, is there anything to prevent them carrying on with whatever research they're doing when the Assembly is resolved as such, or what way?
RAISE is part of a number of networks and has their own, if you like, ability to do horizon gazing papers. So you may recall at the beginning of the 2016 mandate, RAISE had produced a suite of papers about issues that, you know, we're likely to form discussion and debate through that mandate. They can still produce and publish. It's just that these are papers gathered to get information on an issue. They're not papers commissioned by either staff or committees, and obviously papers commissioned by members aren't published. So we wouldn't be commissioning, therefore we wouldn't be publishing.
I understand. I mean, look, there may be a side argument, because I'm not saying particularly on this issue, but in more general about RAID's publishing stuff in a period when there's the Assembly isn't, you know, as it's been dissolved and waiting for an election. I think slightly transgresses at a broader level into making sure public comment on matters and things, but I don't see why there should be any particular, and there clearly isn't any particular restriction on them carrying on work. You know, there's no point in them sitting effectively twiddling their thumbs for 6 weeks, you know, during any...
They'll continue work, Chair, because we have an idea as well about potential legislative programmes going forward. So RAIS are always looking for what's coming, and let's start some work on that, because otherwise there'd be, you know, everything would be working to a very short deadline. So this paper's been commissioned as part of normal bill process, and it will be ready for a particular date, and it will be publishable on that date. The date being, if the committee decides to have a briefing, it's published following that, or if the committee decides not to take it on board, it'll be published generally anyway. It's a research paper on the bill, rather than on a perspective of the bill, if you know what I mean. So here's what the bill does, and here's issues that would be normal consideration of a bill that, you know, would be for the department to answer, particularly in the case of a PMB where it's not come from the department, and therefore there are more things that the department would need to comment on.
Okay, so we'll do that and come back next week.
So are we is the committee agreed then not to proceed with the call for evidence and survey? Can I bank that?
That it's made clear, because this is a bill that will have a wide range of stakeholder interest in it, so it's made clear that we're only doing this because of the time constraints, and in order to protect those stakeholders who would be rushed in delivering anything in the narrow time, in the non-existent time frame that's remaining. And I think that needs to be made very clear. This is not the committee dodging its responsibilities, nor indeed the committee wishing to get out of dealing with this bill. This is an important bill, or it's an important subject in an important bill, and it's valuable that people understand the reason why.
Sure, we'll clarify that in the bill report. It's obviously also been dealt with now in the last couple of weeks in committee, the discussion around the criticism that there was of the previous survey being a 3-week turnaround, and the pressure that put on a lot of sectors. So absolutely that will be very much made clear and on record. And then our members, and it's not something members necessarily have to decide this week, but our members can tend to proceed on the basis that they are looking to reserve their position on the bill, which would mean then no clause by clause or further kind of discussion of clauses there. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful, Chair. And then once you've spoken to the bill sponsor, we can look at the briefing situation.
Okay, so we'll move on, and will we do item number 9 and 10, Peter?
Yes, Chair, if we could do those.
So item number 9 is the SL1, the Education, Student Support, etc. Amendment Regulations NI 2022. There's a clerk's memo at page 122, and the SL1 itself is at page 123. The statutory rule makes provision for support for students taking designated higher education courses in respect of an academic year beginning or after the 1st of September 2022. Specified changes will come into effect when the regulations come into operation. The rule is subject to negative resolution, and the date that the rule will come into operation is February 2022. This is the committee's opportunity to consider the policy set out in the SL1, as it's not possible to amend once the rule has been made and laid in the Assembly Business Office. So are members content with the policy direction as outlined?
Thank you.
And then item number 10.
Sorry, just a sideways from this Could the committee check this with the department in terms of the student hardship fund?
Yeah.
There's a lot of commentary and just in terms of the rising cost of living, students being impacted on. Just see in terms of how healthy the student hardship fund is at the minute, how much is left in it, and access to it.
We'll follow up.
Item number 10 then is a DFE consultation on energy intensive industries. There is a letter and documents on the consultation at page 132. The consultation sets out options for the provision of relief for energy intensive industries from indirect costs of the NIRO. Relief is currently provided through a compensation scheme funded and administered by BES, for which funding has been allocated until March 2023. Feedback from this consultation will assist DFE in reaching a decision on whether relief should continue after BES funding ends, and if so, how it should be implemented. So the consultation is open for 8 weeks and closes on the 7th of April at 5 p.m. So that's for members to note. So moving on, we will just do any other business, which is item number 12. If anybody has anything. And then item number 13 is the date, time and place of the next meeting, which is Wednesday the 23rd at room 10 a.m. Sorry, at 10 a.m. in room 30. And we don't have an informal meeting scheduled for tomorrow.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
30.